Aries, Guardians of Hades romance series. Written by Felicity Heaton. Narrated by Kevin Foley. Chapter 13. Aries wrapped his arms around Megan, savoring his last few moments with her, and stepped to the street she had given him. He set her down and held on to her until she opened her eyes and nodded, letting him know that the dizziness had passed. Gods, he was an idiot. During his time at the gate, he hadn't been able to clear his head at all. He had thought of her every second, and had somehow convinced himself that when he returned to his apartment, he would find her ready to fight him, and she would insist that she wanted to stay with him. Instead, he had found her ready to go. The upset that had been in her eyes in the shower had been gone too, leaving him wondering whether he had imagined it because he was the one who had been hurt. The only time she had spoken was to tell him that she had lost her keys back in the alley the night they had met, which meant he would have to teleport with her again to get her inside her apartment. She didn't look as though she was up for it. Her pale cheeks and the way she kept swallowing were both warning signs that he couldn't ignore. If he stepped with her to her apartment, she would throw up, or worse. "It might be better if we walk up and then you tell me where your spare keys are, or maybe I could open the door from the inside." He rubbed her shoulders through her dark jumper, unable to resist stealing every moment he had left to touch her, even when it was only killing him. She nodded and smiled, and it hit him hard in the chest. He released her and turned away, unable to take her smiles or look at her without suffering. He had to do this. It was better to end things now, and not only to spare himself any further pain. Maybe it was for the best that she hadn't fought him and showed no sign of wanting to stay with him or change his mind, because he was finally finding his resolve and the strength to place his duty before his desires. He would get his power back, and life would return to normal. Maybe he would even forget about her. In a century or so. He followed her into her apartment building, an old red brick affair that had seen better days and stood in a neighborhood that he knew had several mortal gangs affiliated with it. Not the sort of place that he wanted to leave her. It fired every protective instinct he had and only made what he was about to do even harder to stomach. They walked up the dimly lit stairs, and his gaze caught on each tag on the peeling gray painted walls. There were a few demon tags amongst the graffiti. Definitely not the sort of place where he wanted to leave her alone and vulnerable. He closed the distance between them, so they were side by side in the narrow stairwell. She glanced up at him, but he kept his gaze locked dead ahead, knowing that if he looked into her eyes, he would never find the strength to leave her. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor, off a hall that was free of graffiti. It didn't soothe the savage protective side of him that wanted to whisk her away from this place and take her home. He almost laughed at himself. She was home. She didn't belong with him, in his apartment. He was kidding himself if he thought that she did. "This is me." Megan stopped in front of a drab wooden door that needed a new coat of white paint. He glanced at her, and her look turned awkward. "Not all of us can afford to live in nice places. When you've been on the move as much as I have, you learn to compromise." Something dark within him snarled and commanded him to wrap his arms around her and step straight back to his apartment. He beat it into submission. He hated the thought of leaving her here, and the thought that she had evidently spent a large part of her life on the road, traveling from one city to the next. Why? Because she had the power to heal? He wanted to ask, but doing that would only move him closer to her again, shattering the small distance he had managed to build between them. Her gaze briefly met his, and he caught the suffering in it, the loneliness and the agonizing pain. All feelings that he had lived with for so long that they were like family to him, constant companions even when he wished they weren't. She had suffered as badly as he had, and it wrenched at him, made him want to hold her close and whisper that she wasn't alone now because he was right here with her. He closed his eyes and stepped inside her apartment instead. The door was easy enough to open from the inside, even if he did have to unlock several deadbolts. It reassured him that she had protected herself as best she could, but he couldn't help feeling that it still wasn't enough. If someone wanted to get in, they would. And what would happen then? She opened the door and walked past without looking at him, her gaze on the worn carpet. Her apartment was small and dark, with only one window that had a terrific view of a brick wall. He closed the door, slipping all the chains back in place and twisting each lock. He could add a few wards. It might make her feel safer, and it would make him feel a damn sight better about leaving her here. He didn't have the necessary equipment, though, and setting up wards took hours, if not days, depending on how strong you wanted to make them. It was easier to make her leave this wretched place with him. Her kitchen was tiny, right off the front door, and what he thought might be the living room was just as small. How could she live in such cramped conditions? He stalked through the shoebox-sized apartment, searching for her. It took barely 4 strides to reach from the front door to the living room. He glanced right and found her in an adjacent room. She sat on the end of the double bed, crammed into the tiny room, staring at him. The carpets were worn, the lack of natural light sucked. The whole apartment was smaller than his living room, and the neighborhood was shitty, but Megan had somehow made it a home. The walls were brightly colored, painted in jewel tones that lent a warm and exotic edge to the place. The lamps in each room provided enough light and added to the warmth with their soft glow. The feminine touches, like her oversized cream armchair with fluffy cushions, and stacks of well-read books on the shelves, and the colorful glass bottles and vases full of silk flowers, brightened the small apartment. It smelled like her, too, evening sunshine and night-blooming jasmine. Intoxicating. "You're different now," she said, drawing his attention back to her. She sat on the end of the bed, her legs crossed Indian style. A frown marred her beauty, and the pain that had been in her eyes in the shower was back in them, calling to him. He hadn't imagined it. This was hurting her, too. Frustration bloomed inside him, twining with the pain caused by the thought of leaving her. Why hadn't she said anything back in his bathroom, or when he had come back from the gate? Why had she kept silent and held herself at a distance, making him believe she felt nothing for him? Gods, if only she had said something, things might have been different. They might have been coming here to get her clothes so she could stay with him, rather than coming here to part ways forever. He steeled his jaw and hardened his heart. This was for the best. He could see that now. He had come this far, and he had to finish it. He had to return to his world. Without her. I changed the moment I lost my power. He crossed the small living room and leaned against the bright blue painted doorframe. This isn't me. I don't feel like myself. She gave him a short, tight smile, and then picked at the dark pink covers of her bed, her gaze on her fingers. "Do you feel cold without your fire?" He shook his head. "Not when I'm looking at you. I've never felt so hot." Damn. He cursed himself for not keeping that to himself and putting it out there. He was meant to be distancing himself from her, but all it took was a smile from her and he was moving closer again, falling back under her spell and into the easy way they had talked to each other back in his apartment. Nothing held back. She lifted her head and smiled slyly. "Flattery might get you everywhere." "There are some places I haven't been in centuries." He cursed himself again for tossing that one out there, but this time it was because she clammed up, her expression turning wary. He had tried to distance himself from her, and had failed so many times, but she had managed to place an ocean between them in the space of a heartbeat. She muttered something at her hand, fiercely plucking at tiny threads and pulling the satiny material of her bed cover. Aries frowned. What had he said to get her on the defensive? He caught a snippet of what she was saying, something about only wanting her because she was on hand and available, and closed his eyes. Sense said to keep his mouth shut, but his heart overruled his head. Megan, this need I feel for you, this attraction, it was there before I lost my power. He kept his eyes closed and felt hers on him, knew that she wanted him to look at her when he told her this. He didn't have the strength to do such a thing. He had never been any good at expressing his feelings, not the softer variety at least. Rage, fury, disgust, and all the negative emotions flowed out of him like water out of a tap. He sighed, opened his eyes, and found the courage to meet hers. You're beautiful, and damn hot, and I want you. I can't stop thinking about you even when I know that I should. Why? She whispered, pain surfacing in her eyes again, edged with anger this time. Why can't I stop thinking about you? No. Why shouldn't you think about me? Her tone had a hard edge, one that challenged him to man up and confess or face the consequences. A woman scorned. Not what he needed right now. She was sending him in circles, pulling him in 1,000 directions, and he wasn't sure whether he was coming or going, or what were the right and wrong things to say. Because... He raked his hair and swallowed his pride. Because if he was going through with this and leaving her here, he needed her to know the reason why. He needed to be straight with her. He needed her to understand. I don't know what happens when I get my power back, and I don't want to set myself up for pain fiercer than I've felt before. I don't want only a few days or weeks with you, Megan, and you'll never stick around if it turns out I can never touch you again. Shit, that was some hard stuff to say. She stared at him, eyes enormous, full of conflicting emotions. He wasn't sure if she was going to cry, laugh, or curse him. His hands shook, so he jammed them into the pockets of his black jeans. Her expression flitted between anger and understanding. Anger won. Isn't that for me to decide? She snapped and stood, squaring up to him, or at least standing close to him. It was hard to call it squaring up when she was a good 10 inches shorter than he was. He took a step backwards into the living room. You don't know what you're saying. You can't know. You've never had to live with it like I have. She glared at him. So you just get to decide what's best for me? You're scared, I get it. You think this doesn't scare me too? A few days ago I thought I was alone in this world, and now I know there are countless people like me. Most of them more powerful, some of them gods. One of them a man that I can't picture my life without anymore. He tensed and steeled his jaw. That final sentence delivered like a verbal blow to the chest, ripping his ribs open and leaving his heart exposed. Gods! What did she want him to say? That he felt that way too? That he couldn't imagine going back to a world where she didn't exist, and he didn't want to do this? It wouldn't change a God's damned thing. It wouldn't change his mind. He was already hurting badly, too much for him to bear, and he had only kissed her. If he fell in love with her and she left him, it would destroy him. No. It was better this ended now, before it really began. You think you can cope with it, but think about it, Megan. Look me in the eye and swear right now that you would never feel lonely, even when you were with me, if you couldn't touch me, if we couldn't kiss, or even hold hands, or sleep in each other's arms. Her expression softened, and he knew she couldn't say it. He could see it in her eyes, in the pain and the tears that swam in them, and the uncertainty. She stepped towards him, and he countered her, keeping the distance between them even, and shook his head. This is how it has to be. His voice cracked, and he swallowed his breaking heart. I can't choose between you and my power, because it's bigger than that, Megan. What you're asking me to do is choose between you and my duty, and the future of both your world and mine depends on me performing that duty. This is bigger than you and me. "That isn't what I'm doing," she snapped, the tears on her dark lashes trembling. "I would never make you choose like that." He shoved his fingers through his hair and gritted his teeth, struggling for some sense of composure when the ground beneath his feet was crumbling and his whole world was falling apart. "You might not say the words, but it's what your heart wants, isn't it? I know, because my heart wants it too." He cursed the tears that filled both her eyes and his. His voice shook. "I have to get my power back, and it would be torture to remain with you then. I would never be content with only being able to see you, not touch you or kiss you. It would kill me, and it would kill you too." He closed the distance between them, slid his trembling hand along the curve of her jaw, and tilted her head back. Her eyes met his, swimming with hurt, but she didn't speak a word to deny what he had said. He closed his eyes, lowered his head, and kissed her softly, needing to taste her one last time, even though it only pained him. His heart shattered again when she lifted her chin and returned the kiss, her lips gently caressing his, trembling against them, tasting like tears. He couldn't take any more. This would never work, he whispered against her lips, and pictured his apartment, and stepped out of her life forever. Chapter 14. Megan screamed in frustration. She couldn't believe Aries. He hadn't even let her explain her own damn feelings. He had just shoved what he thought she felt at her and tried to make it stick. She growled, grabbed the nearest pillow, and beat the heck out of it until her arms ached. She had never been this mad at anyone before, and there was no way she was going to just give up and let him have his way. He might be a god and might be used to getting what he wanted and having trembling mortals obey him, but she was going to damn well stand up to him and make him listen to her. She wanted to help him get his power back. She knew that he felt lost without it, and she didn't want him to sacrifice anything for her sake. She didn't give a damn about the fate of the world and the other stuff he had mentioned. She just cared about him. He was suffering without his power, and she wanted to end his pain. She threw the pillow down onto the armchair in her living room. Her anger deflated, and her shoulders sagged as the fire in her veins turned to ice. She should have said something to him earlier. She could see that now. Her silence in the bathroom had hurt him, but shock had stolen her voice, and she hadn't known what to say to make him listen to her and stop him from taking her home. Everything had happened so fast. She had barely had time to dress before he had come back from the gate, too, and he had barely looked at her before he had pulled her into his arms and teleported to her street. But she still should have found the time to say something, anything. Her courage had failed her until she had been sitting on her bed, on the verge of losing him, and then it had been too late. Because she hadn't been brave enough to tell him she felt something, that she wanted him to give them a chance and not just give up on them. She had given him time to fill his head with nonsense, and that nonsense had led him to becoming resolved to leave her, no matter what. Damn him. Damn her, too. They were both at fault here. There had to be a way to straighten everything out. There just had to be, because she wasn't going to give up on them, even if he already had. His power. It was the obstacle standing between them. He thought that she didn't want him to get his power back, and that she would leave him if he did get it back. She huffed. If that was the case, then she would figure out how to help him get it back. That would prove that she had his best interests at heart, not hers. She just wasn't sure how to do it. Megan paced the room, wearing out the already thin carpet. How the heck could she convince Aries that she was the right woman for him? That kiss in the shower had blown her mind, and she knew it had blown his, too. Maybe she could sleep on it and something would come to her. She looked at the bed and then turned away. There was no way she could sleep. She was too wired, too riled. It was dark out, but she needed to do something, had to clear her head somehow and come up with an answer. She mulled over how they had met, searching for any clue that might help her find the man who had taken Ares's power. Maybe if she could find him, she could get Ares's power back for him. He had been French, but that had been about it. She didn't know his name, and even if she had it, she didn't exactly have shady connections like people in the movies did, so she wouldn't be able to use it to track him down. There had to be something. She replayed the fight in her head and slowed her pacing until she had stopped dead facing her apartment door. The man had worn some sort of jewelry on his hand, something that had sat against his palm. It had glowed like the amulet Ares had used to open the gate. More than that, the man had worn it on the hand he had pressed against Ares's chest when he had taken his power. She ran into her bedroom, stripped off her dirty clothes, and threw on fresh underwear, a pair of blue jeans, and a dark red camisole and matching jumper. She grabbed her old black duffel coat from her wardrobe and her spare keys and some cash from the bowl on her bookcase in the living room, and shoved her feet into her black sneakers. She had to tell Ares about the amulet the man had worn, because she had a feeling it was important. She hastily unlocked the door, snagging a few of the chains in their slots, and growing more frustrated with each attempt to free them. It was a long way across the city to where Ares lived, but she was sure she could find his apartment. If not, she would find the gate. She was a carrier, part hellspawn, which meant there was a chance that it would respond to her and call Ares. Megan slammed her door and rushed down the winding stairs. When she reached the bottom, she shoved the double doors open. She was halfway down the stone steps when she realized she wasn't alone. She froze and stared at the man standing on the pavement in front of her, his hands in the pockets of his short black leather jacket and the dark gray hood of his sweat top obscuring his face. He casually lifted his head, and the street lamps illuminated the lower half of his face, revealing a thin, wicked smile and his small goatee. "Megan," he said, French accent making her name lilt and sound exotic. She edged backwards, slowly placing one foot on the step above, her heart beating like a jackhammer in her chest. "What are you doing here? Ares isn't here." She eased up onto the step, watching the man, her blood rushing through her ears. She fought for calm, to contain the fear beginning to rise inside her, recalling what Ares had told her. Demons fed on fear. It strengthened them. He was already powerful enough. She had no intention of giving him a boost. If she could just keep her head, maybe she would live through this. It was difficult to tamp down her fear, though. Impossible as she stood facing him, aware that they were the only two people on the quiet street, and that this time no gorgeous god would be coming to save her. His smile stretched into a grin. "I know. Perfect, isn't it?" Perfect? Her stomach flipped, and her eyes widened. He tipped his hood back, and the street lamps cast shadows in the hollows of his cheeks and around his eyes, and threw highlights along the spikes of his blonde hair. "Did you think I wanted that wretched god?" His eyes met hers, cold and dark, sending a shiver tumbling down her back and arms. "I have no interest in him. It is you I need." Megan turned on a pinhead, intending to race back inside the building. The man was there in front of the doors. She gasped and bolted down the steps and cursed herself for forgetting he could teleport. She sprinted along the street, her heart thumping and throat closing. Her lungs squeezed, but she pushed herself as hard as she could, forcing herself to keep running, desperate to escape, even when it felt impossible. She didn't make it far. He grabbed her arm and spun her to face him, and she fought like a wild thing, clawing and punching, kicking and struggling with all her might. She landed a hard punch on his jaw, and then hit him again, knocking him backwards. She wasn't about to die here, or let him take her. His grip on her arm tightened, but he didn't fight back. She threw another right hook, smashing her knuckles into his cheek. Pain shot up her arm, but it didn't stop her. Her fear might give him strength, but it fueled her too, driving her to attack. She landed a knee in his groin. He grunted and released her, and she turned, leaping into action and sprinting. Her legs quivered, weak and already exhausted. The man appeared in front of her. She didn't have a chance to stop. She slammed into him, managing to dip her shoulder at the last second, so it hit him hard in the chest. The force of it drove him backwards and sent him down, and she tried to run past him, but he grabbed her ankle. She crashed into the pavement, her breath leaving her on impact and pain ripping through her, tearing a grunt from her lips. "Get off me!" She kicked at him with her free leg, catching him in the face several times. Blood ran from his nose, covering his lips, and he growled something black and unholy, and yanked on her leg. She cried out as her hip ached, and she skidded along the pavement towards him. He released her ankle, and she didn't give him a chance to grab her again. She punched him, landing a blow between his eyes this time, and pushed onto her feet. She made it barely a few steps before she was knocked off her feet and sent flying through the air. She hit the hood of a car and lay on her back, wheezing, her head spinning. The man slowly approached her, wobbling in her vision. He wiped the back of his hand across his mouth, clearing some of the blood away, and glared at her, his eyes glowing now. A moan escaped her, and she forced herself to move, her back aching as she managed to inch backwards, away from him. His gaze narrowed on her. He flicked the blood off his hand. "You are proving to be trouble, Megan. I hope you are worth it." He raised his hand, the one that had glowed before. In the center of his palm, a gold disc of metal glinted, edged with red stones that shone like fire. Megan shook her head and kept inching backwards. She couldn't let him touch her with that. He would steal her power, too. "How do you know my name?" she said, trying to distract him and buy herself time to think of a way out of this mess. He paused and regarded her with cold hazel eyes. "Amore." She frowned and swallowed, and felt sick when she tasted metal in her mouth. "What?" "You are thinking you do not know my name, and you think you can get away and tell your wretched God all about me. It will not happen, and I prefer to face my enemies on a level playing field. I know your name, and now you know mine." He grabbed her ankle and yanked, dragging her off the hood of the car. A sharp strike of lightning shot up her back when her bottom hit the pavement, and she kicked at him with her free leg, twisting at the same time in an attempt to break free of him. He grinned at her. She hit him in the balls again, but he didn't release her this time. He snapped her foot around, and she cried out, clutching her leg and stilling for a second. It was all the time he needed. He was on her before she could recover, kneeling astride her with his legs trapping hers. One of his hands closed around her throat, and he pushed his weight down onto it, pinning her head against the pavement and making it difficult to breathe. He loomed over her, his hair as pale as snow in the streetlights, and crushed her throat with his fingers, pressing them in hard and throttling her. She gasped at air, panic kicking in, and grabbed his arm, trying to prise his hand off her. He was too strong. Tears stung her eyes, and she kicked her legs, breaking free of his and frantically wriggling beneath him. He pressed more of his weight down on her throat and reached inside his leather jacket with his free hand. Her heart stopped. Her gaze shot to the silver blade in his hand. He cocked his head to one side and ran the tip of the blade down her cheek. Her eyes tried to follow it, the pain in her throat and breathing forgotten. Tears streamed down her temples and cut into her hair. "If you won't come quietly, I will just have to do the business right here." Cold realization dawned on her, and her skin prickled with ice as she stared up into his eyes. He wasn't going to use his amulet to steal her power. He was going to kill her. Amore loomed over her with the blade, and she shook her head, silently pleading him not to do it. He released her neck and smiled right into her eyes, his hazel ones glowing around their edges. "This will only hurt for a second." He grasped the blade in both hands and brought it down hard towards her chest. Megan screamed. Chapter 15. Valen stood in the middle of a swath of open land, his eyes on the city stretching below him, bathed in the golden light of dawn. He couldn't sleep. Not even the 3 demons who had kindly given up their lives, allowing him to drench his hands in blood, had given him the respite he needed. He hadn't slept in almost 4 days. Not since Ares had lost his power and gone off the rails. That was his trick, not his older brother's one, and he didn't like him stealing his repertoire. He prided himself on annoying Karis, and now his big brother's concern was focused firmly on his second-in-command. It blew. The fact that Ares was right about the cities and demon uprising didn't sit well with him either. He wanted to go to war with the animals as much as his next brother, but he had wanted to have a few more years in the mortal world before it happened. Once their mission was over and the demon insurgents vanquished, their father would allow them to return to the underworld. No more shedding demon blood. He would miss that. He curled his fingers into fists. They itched with the hunger to strike bones and split flesh. Maybe he could stay on here in the mortal realm. His family wouldn't notice he wasn't there in the underworld, celebrating a job well done. Fuck, they would probably prefer he wasn't there anyway. Electricity arced up his arms, warming his skin. The stilted golden threads burrowed into his flesh and raced through his veins, leaving hazy heat in their wake as he stared at Rome. It was such a nice morning, and that wouldn't do at all. His power rose, obeying his silent command, and wrapped itself around him, each bolt that chased across his skin increasing the sedated, compliant feeling within him. He let it cross the border, moving from something under his command to something that threatened to control him, and the strength of it increased, scorching his bones and igniting his blood, filling every inch of him until he was juiced to the max and ready to make the world tremble. He loved to make the world quake at his feet. He grinned and looked up at the perfect cerulean vault stretching into infinity above him. A single tiny black spot appeared at the center of his focus and spread, blotting out the blue. Gray cloud rolled across the sky, boiling and raging, swirling in places. Valen half closed his eyes, willing his power to the surface, letting it flow towards his fingertips. He raised his right hand and stared at the city, pressed his thumb and middle finger together. Clicked. A blast of lightning slammed down, splitting like the roots of a tree and sending powerful spikes deep into the earth on a hillside close to him. The scent of mud and ozone filled the air, and his grin widened as he clicked again, commanding another bolt to fork across the boiling black clouds and strike several lightning rods in the city. They glowed fiercely, red-hot from the power that had surged through them. He sighed. Car alarms blared in the distance. He loved that sound. The storm clouds hung lower, heavy with rain. One element beyond his control and sure to put a damper on his fun, even if it was only a slight one. The first fat drops fell, splattering the shoulders of his black shirt and soaking into the material. They gathered speed, hammering at him where he stood out in the open, exposed to the elements. He focused on the city and sent another white-blue bolt of lightning shooting towards it, and then another. Karis had warned him countless times not to terrorize his city. His oldest brother didn't understand him, was too self-absorbed to understand anyone. He wasn't terrorizing his city. He had set up the lightning rods, building ones capable of withstanding the full force of his power. In all the years that he had come to this hillside to let his power out to play, he hadn't once harmed a single citizen or building. When he was fighting demons in its environs was a completely different matter. He brought his hand down in a graceful arc, and a thick purple bolt of lightning branched downwards, striking the metal rods and filling the sky with an ear-splitting crack. His own personal symphony, and he loved the music he made. He waved his hands, conducting his orchestra, giving in to the power flowing through him, savoring the pleasure it brought as it stole his conscience piece by piece, constructing an image of power in its shadow. He grinned again, hazy from head to toe, lost in his own strength. A god, and he wanted the world to know it. He curled his lip at the sky and sent lightning arcing across the clouds. He wanted the gods to know it too, those lazy, weak Olympians who still believed they held all the power when the world had long forgotten them. Mortals feared only what they could touch or feel or see with their own eyes, like a man with the power to command lightning. Water rolled down the longer lengths of his blond hair and dripped from the ends. He focused on the city, pointed out the places he wanted the next bolt to strike, and unleashed it. It shot downwards, splitting and splitting again, following his command, forming a shape above the city. His smile faltered. She had always liked it when he had made dragons for her. The lightning connected with the rods, and the sky rumbled with the force of each small strike, the ground shaking with it, but it gave him no pleasure. He was bored of this game. He let the storm rage, ravaging the city and the land around it. Each strike made Rome flicker between the current world and the other world. It was getting worse. Whenever he killed a few demons, it improved, but not as it used to. Before a few months ago, it would have gone back to somewhere near what he called normal, with the city aflame and some buildings damaged. Now it only showed minimal improvement, like a few buildings would be damaged rather than lying in ruin, and that improvement only lasted a handful of hours. If the other world kept deteriorating at the current rate, he would be looking at total fiery destruction soon. Did New York look as bad to Ares as Rome did to him? Ares was probably too busy mooning over Megan to notice. Valen didn't like her. He had been wary of her the moment he had met her, and had noticed how his older brother looked at her. War was no place for a woman, and she was distracting Ares. If New York fell because of her, Valen was going to kill her. He raised his hand to direct another lightning bolt, and paused. Someone was watching him. It wasn't the first time he had felt it, either. That had been 4 days ago, when he had realized someone had been following him through the city. He subtly scanned the misty hillside and sniffed. The smell of ozone and wet earth from the storm obliterated all other sense, making it impossible for him to tell whether he was alone now or not. Had his stalker gone, or were they still watching him from the tree line? Whoever they were, they could either teleport or were skilled at concealing themselves. If his brothers found out that he had a shadow, they would be angry that he hadn't told them when he had first noticed it. Valen didn't care. He didn't care if they were mad at him for not mentioning it when they found out, or that he should tell them in case it was important. He was going to deal with this alone. He could handle whoever was following him, and he craved a little excitement and danger. He was bored and itching for violence, hungry to let his power loose on a worthy foe. Bring it on. He smiled to himself, and his power flowed through him, stronger than before, intoxicating him. His smile cracked and became a grin that pulled at the scar on his left cheek and down his neck. A tremendous white-purple bolt of lightning slammed down, striking a nearby tree. It exploded, spraying thick splinters of wood everywhere and filling the damp air with the acrid scent of smoke. Slivers of bark hit him, piercing his flesh. He casually pulled each splinter out and discarded it, frowned at the tears in his wet black shirt and the spots of blood left behind, and then flexed his fingers and stared down at his city. Rome. Soon. It flickered between this world and the other world. Very soon. Valen smiled again. They had some balls if they thought they could kill him. They had chosen the wrong brother to fight. He was a god-slayer. He grinned, and lightning struck, shaking the earth and the sky. Bring it on. Chapter 16. Ares paced his apartment, wearing a trench in the oak floor. His heavy footsteps were the only sound in the living room, a beat as somber as his thoughts. He no longer had a reason to keep Megan around. If he had kept her, then it would have been because he wanted to have her while he could, and even if there were feelings behind that desire, it was cruel. In the end, he would have had to let her go, and if they had grown close and maybe even fallen in love when that time came, it would have destroyed them both. He wasn't a fool. The pain that had shone in her eyes and tightened her voice had been hurt that had lanced him, too, ripping him apart from the inside. She had to understand what he was doing, though. She had to know that if they continued down the path they were taking, then it would only end in hurt 1,000 times worse than what they felt right now. He scrubbed his right hand over his hair and heaved a sigh. Since leaving her alone in that unsavory apartment building barely 20 minutes ago, he had told himself close to 100 times, or possibly more, that it had to be this way. She didn't belong with him, and it didn't matter if she thought he was wrong and they could be together. None of it mattered. None of it would make a difference in the end, not the strength of his feelings nor hers. In the end, his power would come between them and tear them apart. Gods, he still wanted her, though. His heart rallied whenever he tried to convince himself that this was for the best. It cried out and fought him, whispering insidious words about it being her choice, and how she had clearly wanted to be with him, and that somehow they could make this dysfunctional relationship work. He could have Megan if he sacrificed one thing, his power. Wasn't she what he wanted most, more than being whole again, more than doing his duty like a good son? Ares closed his eyes and pinched the bridge of his nose. He had no choice. He couldn't forget his power or his duty. He had to get it back and do what was right for the underworld and this world, Megan's world. He finally had a reason to protect it, but to do that, he had to give her up. Darkness coursed through his veins, corrupting his thoughts and shrouding them in shadow. He could take Megan to the underworld. He could get his power back and still be able to touch her. His power didn't manifest itself in his world as it did in hers. They could be together. His top lip curled back, and he snarled at the thought of having her there. His forever. He wanted that. His heart raced, beating hard and forcing the darkness from his blood and his thoughts. The underworld was no place for her, and his father would never consent to her being there. Hades wouldn't care about his need of her. He could beg his father, plead with him until his voice was hoarse and gone, and his father would still deny him. His father was king in the underworld, and beyond particular about who was allowed to enter and leave his realm. Megan was only a carrier, not full hellspawn. To his father, she was barely a step above a demon. He could ask his mother for help. Ares cursed in the mortal tongue. He couldn't. Persephone would want to help, and by doing so, she could incur the wrath of her husband. It was pointless. He heaved a sigh. He had to do something, though. He couldn't function without Megan. The thought that she might be in danger constantly ran through his mind, disturbing his focus, sending it back to her, and he wouldn't be satisfied until she was back in his arms. He needed her with him. His desire for her was fierce and consuming, his feelings so deep that plumbing their depths was impossible. It was more than lust. He knew it. When she was around him, he had felt a soul-deep awareness of her, a need that had left him bereft and cold whenever she was out of his sight, let alone out of his life. He ached for her, right down to his marrow. He had never longed for someone like this, never needed anyone with the intensity that he needed her. It overwhelmed him, commanding him to return to her and bring her back here with him. She was his. He would never let her go. Aries growled and stepped back to her apartment. He stalked through the tiny home and frowned when he couldn't find her. Where was she? The coppery stench of demon hit him, his gut swirling with the sickening feeling of one nearby, and the familiar undertone of it sent a shiver down his spine and awakened his warrior instincts. He braced his feet shoulder-width apart and listened for a sign of his quarry. A scream pierced the silence. His heart pounded, and this time it sent darkness pouring back through his veins. He snarled and stepped again, landing in the street outside Megan's apartment building. His blood froze, and heart stopped. She lay on the pavement a few meters ahead of him, pinned to the concrete slabs by the same damn demon who had taken his power. Her legs flailed, but the man leaned over her, his back to Aries. Rage obliterated his calm, allowing the darkness to crash through him, unleashing it. "It will only hurt for a second," the demon said, and sat back, clutching a small blade in both hands. He brought the blade down fast. Megan lurched up at the same time as Aries stepped and appeared in front of the demon. Her hand slammed into the demon's hand and knocked the blade flying. Funny, I was about to say the same thing. Aries kicked the demon in the head, sending him toppling backwards and tearing an agonized shriek from him. Fresh blood crawled down from his nose, and Aries frowned. Megan must have been fighting hard because the demon was already injured. He stepped behind the demon and grabbed him by his hair, hauling him onto his feet and away from Megan, and flicked a glance at her. She was unharmed save a cut across her chest where the blade must have caught her before she knocked it aside. The sight of that tiny wound was enough to propel him firmly over the edge. He growled, the darkness rising, eating away at his conscience and threatening to obliterate all the good in him. His fingernails sharpened and canines ached. He had only lost it once in his lifetime, and it had scared the hell out of him then. This time, he welcomed the increase in power that came from his father's darkness in his veins. He slammed his fist hard into the demon's gut, knocking him upwards with the force of the blow. The demon exhaled a grunt, and Aries struck him again in the same place, felt bone crack and bend beneath his fist. It wasn't enough. He snarled and caught the demon by his throat, closing his fingers around it and pressing his short claws in until blood spilled in satisfying threads down the bastard's skin. The demon wheezed and kicked out, catching Aries in the left knee, and then his thigh. Aries growled and threw him, sending him flying into a parked car. The alarm squealed. His vision bled into red and black, and he knew the change coming over him would scare Megan if she saw it, but he could no longer control himself. The demon got to his feet and threw his left hand forwards, propelling a blast of air at Aries. Aries stepped and dodged it, came around behind the demon and kicked him hard in the back of his knee, sending him down. The demon growled and teleported. Aries wasn't in the mood for his games tonight. He wanted to kill him, but he couldn't, and that was pissing him off. He couldn't risk losing his power, not now that he knew he needed it to protect Megan from this man's kind, but he could damn well make him pay for hurting her. He dodged another blast of air and stepped closer to the demon. The man didn't have a chance to block his uppercut, or the right hook that followed it. "Hand!" Megan shouted, and he didn't spare her a glance as he fought the demon, evading his wild swings and landing a few hard blows. He was glad she was conscious, but he wished she would use her words. "He has a thingy." That wasn't an improvement. A thingy? He ducked to avoid a punch that came out of nowhere and tracked the demon's hand as it passed him. Nothing fancy about it, just a regular hand. The demon threw himself past Aries, rolled onto his feet, and ran at Megan. Aries pursued him and spotted what she was talking about. The demon wore an amulet, a small gold disc surrounded by rubies, and the bastard wore it on the same damn hand he had pressed against his chest to steal his power. Megan scurried backwards, flipped onto her front, and launched to her feet. The demon closed in. Ares stepped between them, causing the demon to hit him square in the chest. Before he could grab the scrawny little shit, the man had teleported again. He turned, knowing exactly where he would find the man. The demon sprinted away from him, tracking Megan. She ducked between two parked cars and out into the empty road, gaining herself more room to maneuver. He was damned if he was going to let the demon get his hands on her. If he managed to lay a hand on her in any way, he would teleport. The thought of losing her wrenched at his heart and forced him to fight harder, move quicker, and not give up even when he was already tiring. If the demon took her, Ares wouldn't find her in time. The thought of her dying made him growl and step. This time he landed behind the demon, caught his arm, and spun on his heel, flinging the demon back down the street. The man hit the road hard, bounced and tumbled, arms and legs flinging in all directions. The demon's amulet glinted under the streetlights each time he rolled, and Ares' focus honed in on it. He needed that pretty piece of jewelry, and he was going to get it. With a dark snarl and murder on his mind, he stepped into the path of the demon and stopped him with a heavy boot in his gut. The demon doubled over, clutching at himself, and then threw his hand towards Ares. Ares barely dodged the fireball that burst from the man's palm. The heat of it grazed his arm and back as he dove to one side, rolled onto his feet, spun, and backtracked. The demon unleashed another blast, and he sprinted harder, trying to outrace it. The orb of fire whirled past him and struck a car, exploding on impact. Flames licked over the bonnet and windshield, spitting and hissing. Ares stepped when the demon fired again and came around behind him. He grabbed the demon's arm and yanked it down, almost tearing it clean out of its socket. The demon twisted with it and slammed his free hand into Ares' jaw, knocking his head backwards. Ares didn't release him. He tightened his grip and twisted again, flipping the man over his head and sending him hard onto his back on the road. A grunt left him, and then the demon was gone. He pivoted on his heel, crossed his arms in front of his face, and blocked the demon's attack. The blast of air sent him skidding backwards, but he maintained his footing and was ready the moment he stopped. He launched forwards and swung with his right fist. The demon dipped to one side, but didn't manage to evade the blow. Ares caught him hard on the right shoulder, and the man shrieked, leaped away, and clutched it. He smelled blood, grinned. Megan had shot the demon, and the wound hadn't fully healed yet. A weakness, and one that Ares was all too happy to exploit. A quick sweep of his surroundings placed Megan away from the fight, hiding in the shadow of a parked black sedan. He focused on the demon, dodging the bursts of fire and air the man threw at him, luring him further away from her so she would be safe and he could fight unhindered. It was strange fighting the demon when he was using his own damned power. It served to increase his anger and the darkness surging through him now, flowing in his blood, demanding violence and death. He would kill this bastard and then take Megan home. His home, where she would be safe, where she belonged. He focused his attacks on the demon's shoulder, the darker part of him grinning each time he managed to land a blow, eliciting another grunt or shriek from the demon. The demon fought hard, managing to deal blows of his own, but Ares didn't feel them. The darkness raging out of control within him took care of that, numbing his pain and driving him to keep fighting until he had the death and bloodshed he craved. The demon blasted him backwards with another shot of air, and Ares slammed into the side of a silver car. He growled at the man and pushed off, intending to launch himself at the bastard and take him down. The demon disappeared. Ares stepped straight to Megan, appearing right in front of her, black ribbons of smoke swirling around his limbs. The man appeared just a few feet in front of him, his features twisted into a dark scowl. a faint glow around the edges of his irises. He looked as though he was going to attack, and then paused and slowly turned his head towards his right. East. The sky was lightening, and it wouldn't be long before the sun breached the horizon. Ares looked there along the street that ran for miles, and then back at the demon. He was gone. A growl curled from his lips. He wanted to find whoever the demon had stolen the power to teleport from and kick their arse. He turned to Megan and crouched before her. She looked up at him, her tear-streaked cheeks pale and eyes enormous. Her right hand covered her chest, dark with blood that almost matched the color of her jumper. He reined in his temper, fighting for control against the darkness, and managed to get it down from a raging boil to a simmer in his blood, and carefully slipped his fingers around her wrist and eased her hand away from her chest, trying to prepare himself for the worst at the same time. He parted the cut in her jumper. Relief bloomed inside him, stripping the last of his strength away. The thin line across her chest was shallow, barely a scratch. She had caught the blade before the demon could deal any real damage. The thought of it piercing her tore at his restraint, and he had to force himself to remain with her rather than pursue the demon. The bastard could be anywhere by now, and he had more important things to do than go on a wild goose chase to hunt him down. He settled his hands on her shoulders and hoped she didn't notice how much he was trembling. "You okay?" he whispered in a voice tight with his swirling emotions, and she stared up into his eyes, her brown ones softening with the relief that beat in his blood. "I was so scared." She launched into his arms, almost knocking him over, and he wrapped his around her. He closed his eyes, tightened his hold on her, and savored the feel of her in his arms, back where she belonged, where he needed her most. "I'm here now. You're safe. I won't let anything happen to you, Megan." He pressed a light kiss to the top of her head and breathed her in. Her delicate feminine scent roused his need to protect her and almost had him surrendering to another wave of darkness as it surged through him. Not this time. He was right where he needed to be, where she needed him to be, and that was all that mattered. When she was safe again, tucked away in his apartment and protected, he would call his brothers and tell them what he had learned, and he would go out and hunt the bastard who had hurt her. "What were you doing out so late?" He stroked her hair, running his fingers through the silken dark threads, and kept breathing her in, using the feel of her in his arms and the scent of her to calm his blacker urges. She sniffed and turned her head, resting her cheek on his shoulder. Her tears soaked into his black shirt. "I remembered the man had worn something on his hand, and that he had touched you with that hand when he had taken your power. I was coming to tell you about it, and then the demon was right in front of me." Ares growled, and she tensed. He smoothed her hair, wanting to soothe her, silently apologizing for his outburst, and thanking her at the same time. She had remembered something about the demon, and had wanted to tell him. She wanted him to get his power back. He sighed and held her closer. She wanted to help him, and tonight had proven it and made him see that he had been wrong. She didn't want him to choose between his power and her. "I never should have let you leave me." He dipped his head and brushed his lips across her forehead. She drew back and scowled at him. "You were the one who left me, and you were never coming back. Why did you come back?" He dropped his gaze to his knees. "I needed to see you again." She huffed. "I thought you never wanted to see me again." He lifted his eyes to meet hers. They burned with anger, but pain edged them too, and tears lined her dark lashes. He raised his hand and gently cupped her cheek, sweeping his thumb over it to erase her tears. He had hurt her. He knew that. He hadn't meant to, but he hadn't realized that by protecting himself and stopping himself from getting hurt, he would end up hurting her this deeply. "I'm sorry," he husked, holding her gaze, and let the barriers around his heart fall, wanting her to see that he was telling her the truth now, and that being apart from her had hurt him, too. I couldn't live without you. So you came back, she whispered, and smiled into his eyes, hers warming with affection. I couldn't stop thinking about you and what we shared. This feels right to me, Aries. We feel right. But we're so different. You're a god, and I'm human. You're right, and you don't have to apologize. The smile that had been working its way onto his lips faltered and then died. He frowned at her, not quite following her around that last bend. What do you mean, I'm right? He snaked his arm around her waist. If she was about to tell him that she was leaving him, then he was damn well going to make it clear that he wouldn't let that happen. I understand what you were telling me, but I don't care, Aries. I still think we belong together. Her eyes searched his, and he smiled to let her know that he shared her feelings as relief swept through him. I was wrong. He caught another tear with his thumb as it slipped and tumbled down her cheek. We do belong together, and no matter what happens, we'll find a way to make it work, because I don't want to be apart from you again. Gods, he was glad his brothers weren't around to hear what he had just said. He sounded like a sentimental idiot, but he didn't care. All he cared about was making Megan smile, and if spouting hearts and flower shit made those tears in her eyes go away, then he would recite poetry to her until the end of time. She didn't stop studying him, eyes darting back and forth between his, as though she was looking for even the tiniest lie in them. You really mean that? Or will you cast me aside the moment you have your powers back? The venom behind that one stung, but he deserved it. He sighed and stroked her cheek, hoping to soothe away the anger that had risen back into her eyes. I was cruel and way out of line, but I swear to you that I would never do that to you. It was make or break time. He could see that as well as feel it in his gut. Right here, right now. Either he said the right words and she would stay and give him a shot at winning her, or he screwed the whole thing up and she would walk out of his life. Listen to me, Megan, sweetheart. I take it all back, every word. This, us, it scares the shit out of me, and I let that get the better of me. I let fear make me doubt you, and I should never have done that. I just haven't felt like this I haven't felt like this ever. Never? He shook his head. Never. I panicked. My brothers did this whole intervention thing, and I panicked. Her eyebrows shot up. They did what? Maybe he should have kept that part to himself. She looked as though she was going to tear them all to pieces when she next saw them, which would be soon because he had to contact them and tell them everything he had learned tonight. Forget them. What they did just pissed me off, and then we kissed, and it felt so damn good, and I didn't want to let you go, and it scared me. I didn't realize you were scared, too. I've never been so afraid, Aries, she whispered, the hard edge to her eyes softening again. She lifted her hand and cupped his cheek, mirroring him, and then gently ran her fingers along his jaw. He couldn't take it. The light caress sent heat scorching through his blood, and he had to fight the hunger to draw her up against him and kiss her. The middle of a road at dawn probably wasn't the best place for that sort of thing, especially with the gray clouds that were rolling in to ruin another day with more rain. We have to go. As much as he hated to shatter the moment, he wanted her moved as quickly as possible. The demon wouldn't do anything now that dawn was coming. His kind didn't get on too well with daylight, but Ares refused to risk it. I don't want you here when that demon has turned his sights on you. He stood and pulled her up onto her feet. She leaned against the door of the black sedan. He was never after you, she said, and shock rippled through him. What? The man. He said he never wanted you. He didn't care about you. Does that mean he wanted me all along? That night in the alley? He was there for me, wasn't he? He didn't want to frighten her, but he couldn't lie to her either. If the demon was targeting her, It was better she knew so she could be prepared for anything that might happen. He nodded. She wrapped her arms around herself. She didn't need to fear. He would do all in his power to keep her safe. He pulled her up against him and tucked her close to his side, his arm around her shoulders, starting with getting her away from this street and back to his place. "We're leaving," he said, and she looked up at him, her dark eyes full of a strange combination of fear, hope, and affection. "We'll grab some things for you, and then we're going back to my place." He didn't wait for her to respond. He focused and stepped with her to her apartment, landing in the middle of her cramped kitchen by the door. She leaned into him, her breathing rapid and shallow, and then eased away. In here, away from the smells of the street and the world, the scent of her blood was stronger. She removed her black coat, draping it over the armchair in her living room, and then carefully slipped out of her crimson jumper. She frowned down at the dark red line across her chest, and he expected her to heal it. She didn't. "What are you waiting for?" he said, and she looked across the room at him, her eyebrows raised high and eyes round with confusion. "Oh, of course. I won't be more than a minute." She went into her bedroom, and he followed her and found her packing a black backpack. "That isn't what I meant." She stopped and looked at him, the confusion in her eyes increasing. "What then?" "Aren't you going to heal that?" He pointed at the cut across her chest, and she looked down at it again and then up into his eyes. "It doesn't work that way. I can't heal myself." She touched the crimson line, and her fingers came away smeared with red. He frowned. "What do you mean you can't heal yourself?" "Exactly that. I never have been able to." She shrugged. "I don't know why." Why would the demon want a power he couldn't use on himself? Maybe he didn't know that she couldn't heal herself, and therefore he wouldn't be able to either if he took her power. Ice formed down Ares' spine. Or maybe the demon wasn't working alone and intended to heal others with his power. "The man wanted to kill me." She collapsed onto the end of the bed, close to him where he stood in the doorway, and stared up at him, her hands jammed between her knees. She looked small like that, and he could see the fear rising in her eyes again, could feel it calling to him and telling him to draw her back into his arms, where he knew she felt safe. "I would never let that happen." He kneeled in front of her, and she opened her knees. He wedged his hips between them, getting as close to her as possible, and tried not to think about the position he was in, or how many years had passed since he had last been this close to a woman. He took hold of her hands, and she smiled, but there was fear in it still. "We'll clean up that cut, and then get out of here, and you'll feel better. You'll see." When he smiled, hers brightened and gained warmth, and the lingering doubt in her eyes faded. She nodded. "You do have medical supplies here, I presume?" He sat back on his heels and looked around at the clutter on the shelves in her living room, hoping she didn't expect him to find them for her. She nodded again and stood, the action placing her hips close to his face. He groaned inside and tracked her as she crossed the small bedroom, working her way around the bed, and reached into an adjacent room. The light came on, revealing a tiny bathroom barely big enough for a toilet, basin, and shower cubicle. He caught a flashback of their kiss in the shower back in his apartment, and groaned out loud this time. He wanted to pick up where they had left off, but the two of them would never fit in her shower cubicle. He doubted he would fit by himself. His shower was almost the same size as her entire bathroom. She disappeared into the room and then reappeared with a small box. She set it down on the bed and sat where she had been before, temptingly close to him, and he opened the box. Ares took over. He had to do something to keep his hands occupied, or he was going to end up touching her. He rifled through the collection of sticking plasters, ointments, and bandages, and selected some antiseptic and cotton wool. He had watched enough TV and movies during sleepless days to know this combination was favored by mortals. He dampened the cotton wool with the liquid and then stared at the cut across her chest. She tugged the low neck of her red camisole down, and he swallowed. Maybe doing this for her wasn't such a fantastic idea after all. He had a legitimate reason to touch her, and everything male in him said to take it, but he wasn't sure if he was strong enough to stop himself from making this about more than just tending to her wound. His gaze darted to hers. Her brown eyes were dark in the low light, her pupils dilated pools of desire that spoke to his soul. She knew where this might lead them, and she looked as though she wanted it to happen, right here and right now, regardless of the danger. She wanted to finish what they had started back in his shower. He forced himself to tend to her wound, dabbing at it with the damp cotton wool and clearing the blood off her skin. She hissed and gritted her teeth each time the antiseptic touched the cut, and he mumbled an apology, even though he wasn't hurting her on purpose. He glanced up into her eyes again, and she smiled at him, one that hit him hard in the gut and shattered his restraint. He slid his free hand around the back of her head, clutched the nape of her neck, and dragged her mouth down to his, claiming it with his lips. She moaned and leaned into the kiss, slanting her head and delving her tongue into his mouth. He rolled his eyes closed and kissed her harder, tangling his tongue with hers and tasting her warmth. Her knees rubbed his hips, reminding him of where he was, and he couldn't contain the low moan that rumbled up his throat. His grip on her tightened, keeping her mouth against his, and she shuffled closer until the apex of her thighs pressed hotly against his groin. Too much. He broke away from her, breathing hard and struggling to tamp down his raging desire and get it back under control. Her chest heaved right in front of him, breasts half on display as she held her crimson top for him. Gods, he wanted to devour them, wanted to lower his mouth and kiss every centimeter of those lush, creamy mounds. His gaze darted to hers, and the look in her eyes dared him to do it. He fought his need to possess her as it rose sharply inside him, driven on by her. He could have lost her tonight. That thought pushed him to the edge, awakening a hunger to claim her, body and soul, and let her know that she belonged to him now. He never should have let her out of his reach. He would never make that mistake again. We should leave. Those 3 words were the hardest ones he had ever had to say. She leaned towards him and settled her hands on his forearms. He shivered, instantly hot where she touched, and the sense of urgency that had rode him a second before disappeared. "You can take me away later," she whispered, her dark eyes falling to his lips. They parted for her, his breathing coming faster as his heart began to race with anticipation. "I need to kiss you again first. I need you to kiss me again." Aries needed that too, but now wasn't the time. They had to leave. He opened his mouth to utter a protest, but she covered it with hers, and it came out as a deep moan instead, as her lips brushed his, teasing him into submission. He had kissed her twice, but this was the first time she had kissed him, and gods, he loved it. The soft caress of her lips over his, the gentle sweep of her moist, warm tongue, each puff of breath against his skin. All of it thrilled him and made him tremble for more. He angled his head and deepened the kiss, needing more of her, wanting to brand his name on her soul in the same way she was branding hers on his, an indelible mark that would last forever. He would always be hers. She pressed her forehead and nose against his, her hands easing up his arms, fingers scalding him as she traced each curve of his muscles. His mouth turned dry, body quaking under her touch as it overloaded his senses. He couldn't take it. Even the barest or most innocent of caresses drove him right to the edge until he balanced there, ready to give up the fight and fall into her arms. Her hands skimmed over his shoulders and then up his neck, coming to rest against his cheeks. She pulled back and stared deep into his eyes, and it was game over when she spoke. Make love to me. Chapter 17. Ares captured her lips again, drinking deep of them and buying himself some time to rein his hunger back in, so when they finally made love, he wouldn't end up embarrassing himself. His heart thumped against his ribs, hard and heavy, a beat that turned his stomach and set it alight with nerves. His hands trembled so he grasped the bedclothes on either side of her hips, bunching them into his fingers. He didn't want Megan to feel how badly this was affecting him. He wanted to make love to her, just as she had asked of him. He wanted it to be perfect, and if she realized he was already on the verge of coming undone, it would be anything but that. She snaked her arms around his shoulders and drew him closer to her. Her hot core pressed against his groin again, and he eased back, unable to bear it. Whenever she was against him, he wanted to tear her clothes off and lose himself in her. If he did that, she would think she had been right about him, and he only wanted her for one thing. His trembling subsided, and he risked touching her. It instantly started right back up, and his fingers shook against her sides, fluttering there and probably betraying his nerves. If they did, and if she noticed, she didn't say anything. She continued kissing him, her lips dancing over his, as though she couldn't get enough of his taste and wanted more. He wanted to drown in her, wanted to kiss her until neither of them could breathe, and they had to break apart. He swallowed, dragged his courage up, and slipped his hands beneath the hem of her red top. Gods! She was warm and soft. He settled his hands around her waist, absorbing how good she felt beneath his fingers, and that he was touching her. He still had trouble believing that. Whenever he touched her, it felt as though he was dreaming, and any moment now he would end up hurting her. Her fingers moved to the front of his black shirt, and he slowed his kisses as she began to slide each button free of their holes, his focus shifting there. He wanted to feel her hands on him, would die for it. He realized he had stopped kissing her when she moved back, her face a picture of concentration laced with desire and excitement. She slid the last button free and parted the two sides of his shirt, her eyes lighting up as they roamed over his bare torso. Even that burned him, heat following her gaze, ramping his desire up another notch. She reached out, and he tensed in anticipation of her touch, and every muscle on his torso tautened. She groaned, a low murmur of appreciation that set his blood on fire, and lightly ran her fingertips down his chest. Ares sank his teeth into his lower lip and closed his eyes, hissing out his pleasure as her fingers traced his muscles and roamed over his body. The slow pace of her exploration drove him crazy, until he was on the verge of begging her for more. She skimmed her palms over his pectorals, then raked nails over his abdomen, each mark blazing like wildfire, and finally settled her hands on his hips. He tensed again and swallowed to wet his throat. It was drier than a desert, and his heart skipped a beat. Anticipation coiled tight in his stomach, threatening to explode at any moment. He couldn't take it. He stared into her eyes, silently begging her to put him out of his misery. She knew where he needed her to touch him, wanted to touch him there too, and he couldn't bear this torture any longer. She bit her lip, white teeth teasing it and making him want to kiss her again. He lowered his hands to her hips, running them over her thighs and then onto her arms, caught hold of her wrists and made her move her hands, a gentle nudge in the right direction. She smiled wickedly, eyes bright with her amusement, as though she had been waiting for him to make her do something. Had she been trying to see how long he could bear to have her hands on him, so close to where he needed her most of all? He growled low in his throat, the thought of her teasing him, pushing him firmly over the edge, and turned the tables on her. Before she could move her hands, he caught the hem of her red top and pulled it up, revealing the smooth plane of her stomach. Her hands left him, arms rising, allowing him to pull her top off over her head. Ares groaned. Teal underwear. "You're like candy, all colorful, all shades of delicious and tempting. I want to devour you, he husked, and her cheeks darkened, her teeth nibbling on her lower lip again. He loved to make her blush, liked seeing how much he affected her with only a handful of words. She giggled. I like color. It makes me feel good. He smiled, and his heart skipped another beat when he cupped her bra-clad breasts, feeling the weight of them in his palms, and wishing he had already stripped away her colorful wrapper so he could come good on his words and devour her. You should wear colorful tops, too, then, he said, and her face fell. I don't wear it on the outside. Her voice lost its playfulness, and he frowned. I don't like to draw attention to myself. You're beautiful, he murmured, and she blushed again. That will always draw attention. She looked down at her knees, and he gently caught her cheek and lifted her head. Why don't you like people noticing you? He whispered, and searched her eyes, trying to see the reason in them. She shrugged and looked away, staring over his shoulder. He stroked her cheek with his thumb, giving her time to find her voice. Megan looked back into his eyes. I feel like a freak. Like if people notice me on the street, they'll see my power somehow, or that I'm different to them. His heart went out to her, and he pressed his lips to hers and slowly kissed her, needing to reassure her with some form of physical contact as well as with words. There's no reason for you to be ashamed or scared because of your power. He smoothed his palm over her cheek and traced the line of her jaw with his fingers. It's a good thing, Megan. I know you've felt alone in this world, but you're not alone anymore. I'm right here with you. Tears lined her lashes, and he kissed them away. He hadn't meant to upset her. He had only wanted to make her feel that she wasn't alone now, and she had no reason to be afraid or to feel as though she didn't belong in this world. It was as much her world as it was anyone else's. He had been without physical contact for a long time, but he had never been alone, not like Megan had. His parents had raised him well, and his brothers too, making them all comfortable with their powers, making them feel as though it was normal. He had grown up surrounded by others like him, but she had never had anyone to talk to about what had happened to her. She had wandered the world, searching for someone like her, and now she had found them. Him. She might be mortal, and he might be a god, but they both wielded powers. They weren't so different after all. Megan scrubbed the heel of her hand across her eyes, and then kissed him again, harder this time. He wrapped his arms around her waist, setting one hand in the small of her back and the other between her shoulder blades, and pulled her closer to him, until her body was flush against his, and held her there as he kissed her, wanting to take away her fear and all the pain in her past with it. The way her mouth moved against his, and her soft breath fanned his face, was bliss. His fingers tightened against her back, pressing into her soft flesh, and he struggled to breathe as he kissed her, losing himself in her and the moment. When he was about to deepen the kiss, she took them down a different path. She slowed the kiss, and it lightened to bare sweeps of their lips against each other, soft caresses that stirred his insides, making them flip and flutter. He had never kissed like this before. It heightened everything, his emotions and arousal, until he was hyper-aware of every brush of her body against his, every shift of her fingers against the nape of his neck, and every sweep of her lips over his. He drowned in her, losing awareness of the world. She filled his senses and his focus, and everything else fell away, leaving only her and this beautiful moment. Come, she whispered against his lips, and shuffled backwards out of his reach. He swallowed and watched her with hooded eyes, fear rising within him again as she moved up the bed, her shy smile and glittering eyes tempting him to follow her. He couldn't move, though. As much as he wanted to mount the bed and join her, He couldn't convince his body to do what his head and heart were screaming at it to do. He kneeled at the end of the bed, gaze fixed on her, struggling to overcome the debilitating bout of nerves that were no doubt making him look like a fool to the beautiful woman waiting for him. Her smile widened and softened, her eyes filling with warmth and understanding. She kneeled on the bed and crawled back to him, giving him a glorious view of her breasts in her teal bra. When she reached him, she stroked his cheek and stared deep into his eyes. She gently kissed him and ran her hands over his shoulders. "It's okay." He closed his eyes and let out his breath, relaxing a notch as she pushed his shirt off his shoulders, and he removed it, letting it fall onto the worn carpet. She kneaded his shoulders, palms warm against his skin, working out the rest of his tension, and then trailed her fingers to his upper arms. A smile curved her kiss-swollen lips as she traced the spikes of his favor mark on his left deltoid, her touch so light it tickled and made him want to close his eyes, and then ran her hands down his arms to his. She curled her fingers around to brush his palms and sat back. He stood, obeying her silent command. Her gaze dropped to the front of his jeans, and she released his hands. He trembled like an idiot again, gaze tracking her hands as she brought them forwards, towards him. She slowly undid his belt, and the top button of his jeans followed it. She eased each button free of its hole, working her way downwards, each one ratcheting up his tension another degree. By the time she had reached the final button, he was shaking right down to his boots. She slipped her hands inside, skimming them over his hips, and slowly pushed his black jeans down. He cursed himself for being so weak in front of her. He'd been naked around her once already. He should have gotten over it then. It had been different, though. In the bathroom, he had sworn he would only kiss her. Now she wanted to take things further. She wanted to make love. He groaned and tilted his head back when she caught the waist of his black trunks and pushed them down to his knees. The first brush of her fingers over the sensitive head of his shaft had his knees threatening to buckle beneath him, but he stood firm, every muscle tensing to keep him upright. She moaned low in her throat, a hum that satisfied him and made him feel that she liked what she was touching, and she liked it a lot. She gently circled the head with her fingers, teasing him, and even that simple touch was almost too much for him. He jerked his hips backwards, placing himself out of her reach, needing a moment to claw back some control. "There's no rush," she said, and he cracked his eyes open and looked down the length of his body at her. The sight of her so close to him, eye level with his hard length, tore a groan from his lips. "We can start out slow." That floored him. He couldn't believe how incredible she was, how she accepted this side of him and embraced it, rather than thinking he was weak because of it. "I'm touched that you're not hiding from me," she whispered, and he knew what she meant. He hated appearing weak, but he couldn't hide how weak she made him, and how much he needed her, and he could see in her dark eyes that she was telling the truth. It pleased her that he was so unguarded around her, allowing her to see everything in his heart, all his fears and his flaws. She lightly ran her fingers down the length of his shaft, and he swallowed as she leaned closer, the silken threads of her hair grazing his erection, and kissed his stomach. He groaned, and she looked up at him through her long, dark lashes, working her way upwards towards his chest. Her hands settled on his hips, and she flicked her tongue over his left nipple, eliciting another low, rumbling moan from him, and then pressed soft kisses over his chest. He arched into her lips, needing more from her, and unable to stop himself from seeking it. "It takes a strong heart to show weakness," she whispered against his skin, and placed a kiss on the spot over his heart. "You're not alone, Aries. I'm weak too, trembling inside for you. I haven't been with a man in a long time, since I discovered my power over a decade ago." He growled low in his throat at that. It did him in, cranking up his protective and possessive side until he wanted to lay some sort of claim on her and make her belong to him forever. He wanted her to be his and his alone. He caught her around the nape of her neck and kissed her hard, bending her body into his. She moaned into his mouth, the breathy sound driving him on, and he stepped into her. The heat of her stomach against his cock tore another groan from his throat, and she turned up the heat by wrapping one hand around his hard shaft. He thrust into the ring of her fingers, unable to hold back, and kissed her deeper, pouring out his passion and drinking hers. She giggled and broke free of his lips, peppering his jaw with kisses. "Your stubble is scratchy." "Sorry," he said, and then groaned when she giggled again and spoke. "Don't be. I love the rasp of it against my skin." Gods, he couldn't take it. He shifted his head and recaptured her lips, kissing her breathless as he skimmed his hands down her back, clutched her bottom and tugged her against him, trapping her hand and his erection between them. She moaned and nibbled his lower lip, and he tried to do the same to her, but she evaded him and kissed down his neck. He tilted his head back again and released his breath in a sigh as she worked her way downwards, lavishing his chest with kisses and playfully nipping at his stomach. She swirled her tongue around his navel, and her hand left his cock. He held his breath again, waiting, trying to steady his body so he didn't make a fool of himself when she touched him again. She didn't use her fingers. The feel of her soft, warm lips brushing his length ripped a deep groan from him, and he jerked his hips forward, thrusting towards her. She flicked her tongue over the sensitive head, teasing him until he was delirious and close to begging for more, and then wrapped her lips around him and took him into her mouth. Gods, he really couldn't take it. He grasped her shoulders and tried not to squeeze her too hard, but the delicious feel of her hot, wet mouth sliding up and down his length, sucking at him, pushed him to tighten his grip. He tried to relax. Should have been easy, but he couldn't manage it. Every muscle went taut as a bowstring, and he arched backwards, thrusting his hips towards her. She moaned and wrapped her fingers around his shaft, moving her hand in time with her mouth. Too good. Too damn good. He groaned and squeezed his eyes shut, gritted his teeth and fought back the tide rising within him, threatening to sweep him away. She moaned again, pressed her tongue in hard along the underside of his shaft, and squeezed him with her hand. He bucked forwards, couldn't have stopped himself even if he had tried, and slowly pumped in time with her movements, losing himself all over again, flushed with heat and arousal that steadily built towards a crescendo. His balls drew up and shaft tightened, rigid with need. "Close," he muttered, and clutched her shoulders, groaned when she responded by sucking him harder and faster. She wanted him to explode in her. Gods! Just the thought catapulted him over the edge. Heat rushed through him, a simmer that quickly became a boil, spreading wildfire through his veins. He jerked forwards, thrusting his length deep into the welcoming warmth of her mouth, and cried out as he came, a shock wave of electricity lighting up every inch of him as he spilled. She moaned and lapped at him, and he watched her, breathing hard and trying to take in what had just happened. She knelt on the bed before him, her mouth wrapped around his flesh, one hand on his hip and the other on his length. A beautiful, erotic image he would never forget. She ran her tongue up his cock and sat back on her knees, and he kept hold of her shoulders and stared down into her eyes, slowly gathering the scattered pieces of his senses. She smiled. "Your eyes have gone all shiny and red again, like you're on fire inside." Ares growled and swooped on her mouth, kissing her hard and forcing her backwards onto the bed. Her knees came up as she fell onto her back, catching him in the chest, and he stumbled, his legs caught up in his jeans. Not quite what he had planned. He rolled off her and kicked at his jeans. She hopped off the bed and helped him, making fast work of his clothes, and paused when he was naked. Her gaze raked over him. He lay back and let her drink her fill, not wanting to rush her even when he was dying to touch her. He loved it when she looked at him, her eyes dark with desire that he stirred, hunger for him. She undid her belt, and his gaze instantly fell to follow her hands. He wasn't the only one who could stir desire. His cock twitched as she slowly unzipped her jeans and eased them down her long legs. Gods, he wanted those wrapped around his backside as he made love to her. She stepped out of them and stood before him in only her teal underwear, igniting a fierce need to unwrap and devour her now. He sat up, grabbed her hand, and yanked her onto the bed. She giggled, and he silenced her with a kiss, rolling so he was laying half on top of her, his chest against hers. She moaned and wrapped her arms around his neck, tangling her fingers in his hair. "What do you want to do to me?" she whispered, and he kissed down her jaw towards her neck. "Devour you," he murmured between kisses, and lightly bit the curve of her throat. She moaned and arched her chest into his. The rasp of her lacy bra against his flesh diverted his attention back to her breasts. He kissed and nipped at her collarbone, and then slowly moved down her. The cut across her chest was dark, the skin around it angry red. He wanted to cover it with something, but she didn't have a sticking plaster long enough, and a bandage would be no use. It was high on her chest, in a place that would be difficult to cover with a bandage. He kissed around it, tasting antiseptic, and continued downwards. She twisted the lengths of his hair in her fingers and arched again, as if he needed any encouragement or an indication of where she wanted him. He stared at her bra. He stared at it for so long that Megan slumped into the bed, and her hands left him. She propped herself up on her elbows and frowned at him. "Something wrong?" she said, her voice soft and edged with confusion. "No, not at all." Aries eyed her bra. There was a trick to them. He had tried to catch it when watching movies and TV shows where any man removed a woman's undergarments. He had thought he had it figured out, but now that he was face to face with one, he had forgotten where to start. "How long did you say it had been since you last did this?" There was a smile in her voice. He wasn't amused, and she shouldn't be either. "I'm guessing brassieres hadn't been invented then." He was damned if she was going to emasculate him. He pulled her up and peered around the back of the bra. It looked simple enough. A few hooks and eyes. He couldn't go far wrong. He reached around both sides of her. His hands met at the back, over the fastenings. He peered over her shoulder, and she giggled again. "Do you want a hand?" she whispered into his ear, hot breath teasing him and putting him off what he was doing. "No," he snapped, and focused on his hands and the infernal contraption. He took hold of both sides and pushed them together. The first hook gave, but the other was trouble, clearly intent on defying him. He growled and tried harder. It wouldn't give. She stifled a laugh. He growled and yanked both sides, snapping the fastening. "Hey, I liked this bra." She shoved his shoulder, and he didn't even feel it. He basked in his victory over the infernal bra she proclaimed to have loved. "I'll buy you a new one." He hooked his fingers under the straps running over her shoulders and peeled the garment away. She lay back, the action helping him, and when he looked down at her, she was topless and he was holding her bra. He tossed it aside and smiled wickedly as he settled his hands on either side of her ribs and stared down at her. She didn't look angry. She was smiling, the sort she gave him when she was waiting for him to make a move. An open invite. He shifted his gaze to her breasts. Dusky pink buds topped the creamy mounds, and he couldn't wait any longer. He lowered his head and wrapped his lips around one nipple, sucking it into his mouth. She moaned and arched up again, pressing her breast against his lips, and he slid one hand beneath her and held her to him as he alternated between suckling and rolling the sweet bud between his teeth. His other hand quested downwards, and he delighted in the feel of her soft, supple stomach, her skin hot against his palm, and then groaned when he reached the barrier of her panties. Her backside lifted off the bed, the motion forcing his fingers past the waist of her lacy underwear. It gave him the confidence to continue, and he shifted his hand lower, brushing the first neat curls covering the juncture of her thighs. He groaned again against her breast, and his cock throbbed, hardening again, hungry to be where his hand was heading. He pressed his hard length against her hip and slung his right leg over hers, looping it around. She wriggled against him, rubbing his erection, teasing him as he teased her. He flicked his tongue over her nipple, eliciting a breathless moan from her, and she tangled her fingers in his hair again, holding him in place against her breast. He liked that. He had never been with a woman who had been so forward about what she wanted. He dipped his fingers into her plush folds and stilled. Gods, she was so warm and wet, slippery with desire. He delved lower, found her pert nub, and circled it with his fingertips. She moaned, and her hands seized his shoulders. He wanted more. He swallowed, the last of his nerves melting away under the heat blazing between them, and moved off her, releasing her nipple. She groaned her disapproval, and then wriggled when he moved downwards, settling himself between her legs. She shuffled up the bed until her head hit the pillows, and lay before him, shifting her knees side to side, restless and with hunger in her eyes. He growled, a possessive snarl that caused a flush of color on her cheeks, got down on all fours, and crawled up the bed to her. She parted her knees, inviting him closer. He hooked his fingers into the waist of her panties and pulled them down her thighs, revealing the soft thatch of dark curls that concealed heaven from his eyes. He tugged her underwear off and tossed it over his shoulder to join the rest of their clothes, and then took hold of her knees. He spread them again, waiting to see heaven. She obeyed, opening for him, and he groaned at the sight of her. He wanted that. He skimmed his hands down the insides of her thighs, burning at 1,000 degrees, and shivered when his fingers brushed her soft curls. He slid his fingers into her velvet folds again, and his eyelids fell, hooding his eyes. She felt so good, so hot and moist. His cock throbbed, eager to be sheathed in her. Not yet. He wanted to feel her first. He wanted to taste her as she had tasted him. He lowered his hand, his eyes locked on her face, studying every flicker of pleasure that crossed it, learning what she liked most, and swirled his finger around her nub. She murmured a low groan of pleasure, and he eased his hand lower. Her hips shifted to meet him, her eyes half closed, dark with desire. Her lips parted as he nudged one finger inside her and slid it deep into her core. He bit his tongue to stop himself from exploding all over her bedclothes. She felt too good, so ready for him. He slowly pumped her with one finger and then added another, stretching her tight sheath. She moaned and worked her hips, undulating them in time with his thrusts. God, he wanted to feel her do that against his cock. "Aries," she breathed, and he growled, the sound of his name spoken in her pleasure-drenched voice too much for him to bear. "More." She gasped when he thrust his fingers all the way in, as deep as they could go, and arched her hips off the bed. With a dark snarl, he hunched over her, wedged her thighs apart with his shoulders, and spread her with his other hand. He swept his tongue over her nub, thrusting 2 fingers slowly and deeply into her at the same time. She groaned and writhed, riding his mouth and his fingers as he switched between flicking his tongue over her arousal and suckling her. "Aries," she moaned again, the sound music to his ears. Her hand came down, fingers twisting his hair around them, holding him fast. He loved the feel of her commanding him in her own way, and obeyed her, staying right where she needed him to be. She tasted like jasmine, too, succulent and sweet. He licked her from core to nub, tasting all of her, and thrust his fingers deeper. She rode them, moving faster and faster, her breathing coming quicker with each shift of her hips. "More," she gasped, and he gave it to her, licking and suckling, plunging harder and deeper into her, until he could feel her tensing and knew she was close. She bucked her hips up, tightened around him, tugged on his hair, and cried his name at the top of her lungs. Her body trembled, quivering around his 2 fingers, her thighs shaking against his shoulders. He eased her down with slow, deep strokes of his fingers and gentle sweeps of his tongue, not wanting to relinquish her just yet. She wriggled and giggled, pulled away from him, and collapsed onto the bed, breathing hard and fast. He propped his chin up on his left hand and held her gaze as she smiled down at him. When he sucked his fingers clean, her eyes darkened again, passion flaring back up in them. His cock pulsed against the mattress. Megan crooked her finger at him. Aries obeyed. He would obey her until the end of time. He got onto his hands and knees and crawled up the bed to her, settling himself between her thighs. They trembled still, quivering with her climax, and he smiled inside at that. 300 years, and he could still remember how to do things. It came naturally where Megan was concerned. She was so open with him, letting him know what she wanted and how she liked things. He had never had a woman like her. She was 1 in a billion. She kissed him, slow sweeps of her lips that stoked the fire inside him, bringing it back to inferno level, and he thrust his hard length against her stomach, feeling her heat and her moisture against him. He wanted to be inside her. He drew back and stared down into her beautiful brown eyes. She smiled. "I'm reading your mind." "Yeah?" he said with a smile of his own. "What am I thinking?" "I'm on the pill." She hooked one arm around his neck, brought him back down to her, and kissed him again, harder this time, making him burn all over. He rubbed his aching shaft against her, and her hand moved to his chest, and she pushed him backwards. "I take it you're clean?" He frowned. "Clean?" "I've never had unprotected sex, but you've been around a while." He didn't like the way she said that. It made him feel old. Gods don't get diseases. "That's all I needed to hear." She dragged him back down and kissed him again. Aries settled on top of her, her breasts pressed against his, heart hammering discordantly to his. He moved his weight to his elbows and deepened the kiss, savoring how she felt beneath him, warm and soft, fitting him perfectly. "Make love to me, Aries," she whispered against his lips, and he groaned. Damn, he could do that. He shifted backwards and wrapped a hand around his cock. He teased her with the head, sliding it up and down. She was so hot and wet. He wasn't sure in the end whether he was teasing her or himself. She moaned, and he inched lower, hazy from the feel of her against him and the thought of what he was about to do. The head of his cock nudged inside. A strange, sharp sensation pierced his chest. Aries growled. "Not now, damn it." "What is it?" Megan gasped and tensed. He moved his hips backwards, away from her, and ground his teeth, cursing the gods inside his head. So damned close. "Someone has broken through the barriers around my apartment." He really wanted to pretend he hadn't said that, to take it back and make up some bullshit about it being nerves that had stopped him. He couldn't lie to her, though, or ignore what he had just felt. "We have to go, don't we?" she said, and he was glad that she had managed to maintain her understanding streak and wasn't going to fly off the handle at him about stopping just as things were getting started. He sat back and groaned, his shoulders slumping with it. His cock ached, telling him to forget his apartment and finish things. He couldn't. He glanced at Megan, and she looked as frustrated as he felt. "I'm going to kill whoever it is." She huffed and scrambled off the bed, giving him a lovely view of her petite rear, and disappeared into the bathroom. He told himself to move. It wasn't easy when he was harder than steel and his balls ached. He seconded her idea, only he was going to be the one doing the killing. She reappeared and grabbed some more clothes from her closets. She pulled on some rather fetching lilac underwear that didn't help his problem, especially when she bent over again, flashing him a view of her bottom in the thong. He groaned. She straightened and faced him, her cheeks flushed and eyes full of a silent apology. He forced himself to move, wincing the whole time, his mood rapidly degenerating. He pulled his clothes on, and by the time he was dressed in his black jeans, shirt, and boots, he had a single-track mind fixed on bloodshed. Megan finished dressing in a dark purple jumper and blue jeans, and rammed the last of her things into her black backpack and zipped it closed. He grabbed it from her, then grabbed her, pulling her close to him. His body instantly responded, painfully hard in seconds, and he groaned again. She smiled, her eyes promising that they would finish this later, and kissed him. He pictured his apartment and stepped. He had never teleported when kissing before. It was a strange experience, leaving him feeling as though part of him melded with her in the process. He sat down in his apartment and lowered her, but held her close to him, keeping one arm curled around her and the other free in case he needed to fight. His apartment was a mess. Whoever had been here had done a real number on it. They had pulled every drawer out and tossed his clothes across his bedroom. The DVDs, CDs, and magazines lay strewn across his wooden floor, and they had even moved all of his furniture and gone through the cupboards in the kitchen. Aries growled and scanned the apartment, hunting for the one who had wrecked his place. His mood took a nosedive. The intruder was gone, leaving him with no one to unleash his anger on. He pressed a kiss to the top of Megan's head. "Stay here." He drew a deep breath to steady his rising anger. This demon was really beginning to piss him off. It must have been him. But why had he risked coming here during the daylight when he should have been laying low to avoid the danger of the sun? Not only that, but the gates couldn't be opened during the day, so he and his brothers always slept from dawn until dusk. Only the demon had fought him near Megan's apartment. The man must have figured that Aries would stay there for a while with her and that he would have time to break into his apartment and look for something. What? He stalked around the apartment, his body wound so tightly with anger and hunger that he was fit to burst. He felt Megan's gaze following him, the heat of it scorching him, making him want to forget looking for what the demon had been after and go to her, pin her against the wall, and finish what they had started. He glanced at her as he passed her, and then forced himself to look away in case he gave in to his urges. His gaze settled on his bedroom. Maybe he could pick things up in there. He wanted to lay her down on his bed and make love to her for hours. He frowned. Bedroom. He quickened his pace and rounded the corner, heading for the closet in his bedroom. The door was open. He stopped dead and stared at his shield on the back wall. "Shit." "What is it?" Megan called from the other room. "The bastard has my amulet. He has the key to my gate." Chapter 18. Valen sat on the hillside overlooking Rome, studying the city as it sparkled in the warm evening light. The sight was soothing, but it wasn't the only reason he felt relaxed today. "How have you been?" the woman sitting beside him said as she combed her fingers through the silken sheet of her long red hair. She gathered sections of it on either side of her head, near her temples, and plaited them as she awaited his answer. He wasn't sure what to tell her. She finished the 2 long braids and knotted them at the back of her head over the rest of her hair. Her luminous green eyes shifted from the scenery laid out before her and settled on him, unnerving in their intensity. The evening sunlight played on them too, making the gold flakes in her irises twinkle, and washed over her fair skin, warming it until she glowed. She was beautiful. He had thought that for as long as he could remember. There was none in this world or the underworld or all of Olympus as beautiful as her. "It has been a while since we have seen each other, and I am sorry about that. Will you not speak to me?" Her soft voice implored him, as warm and mellow as a siren song, soothing to his ears. Valen nodded and looked at her. He didn't care that she'd had to stay away. She was here now, and that was all that mattered to him. She reached across, causing the long, sheer sleeve of her black gown to fall back, revealing her slender, pale arm, and laid her hand on his cheek. Her skin was cool against his, feather-soft, but it warmed him. "You seem troubled." Her fine eyebrows pinched together. "I'm not worried about myself. I'm worried about Ares." He hated how her hand slipped from his face, and she looked beyond him, her gaze unerringly locking on the location of New York, thousands of miles away. "What trouble has he gotten himself into now?" There was a hint of affection in her eyes, and he didn't like to see it there. "Ares has a woman," he said, not bothering to keep the spiteful, sharp edge from his voice. "We're placing bets on whether or not he'll decide to keep her and give up his power, or give her up and keep his power." She frowned at him, her green eyes darkening to match the grass beneath them. "That seems rather cruel of you all. What bet have you placed?" He looked away from her, fixing his gaze back on the rooftops of Rome. "I don't give a fuck what he does." She sighed, soft as leaves rustling in a light summer breeze. "I know that is a lie. You do not have to pretend with me, not as you do with your brothers." Her hand cupped his cheek and applied the barest hint of pressure. He obeyed, turning to face her again, but didn't meet her gaze. He fixed that on her other hand where it pressed into the earth. Deep golden flowers had twined around her fingers, blossoming between them, and he knew she had chosen that color on purpose to reflect his eyes and his hair. She always did sentimental shit like that, but he couldn't hate her for it, even when he despised that color and the pain it brought him, reminding him of another female, one lost long ago, but one he would never forget. "Tell me what you truly think. Are you not happy that your brother may have found a woman he loves?" Valen didn't want to think about that. He wished he had never brought it up. "I honestly don't give a damn what he does. Why should I?" he snapped, and shirked her touch. She flinched away, and he glanced at her, briefly meeting her emerald gaze and issuing a silent apology for shouting at her. He should have held his tongue or spoken more lightly to her. "Because your brother would care if it was you who was in his situation." He dismissively waved his hand. "Do not coddle me with that rubbish when you know the truth. Ares and the others don't give a damn about me. They don't trust me." She tried to touch his face again, but he shuffled away from her, placing a small distance between them. She sighed again, the sound musical and light, despite the growing frustration he could sense in her. "One day, it will be you in the same situation. If you had to choose between your power and a woman, What choice would you make, Valen? He snorted. My power. It's the only thing I have left, and the one thing I can trust. She sighed again, but there was an edge to it this time, a sense of encroaching darkness. He was trying her patience. She had come here to see him, and he was acting up when he should have been making the most of this precious time with her. She laid her palm on his left cheek, and he didn't try to evade her. You know deep in your heart that is not true, and that one day you will find the right woman. She moved her hand lower, and her fingers caressed the line of his jaw. He knocked her hand away from his face, hating how she always touched his scar. He couldn't stand how the pain tore at his heart whenever she touched him there, and the memories it dragged to the surface. He growled at her. Stop lying to me. I hate it when you lie to me. I am not lying. Valen shot to his feet and glared down at her, his anger rising, darkness obliterating the light she inspired in him. Did the Morai tell you that there's a woman out there who could love me? No. Then there isn't, he barked, and she flinched and pulled her knees up to her chest. The black layers of material covering them blended into the black bodice of her dress. I sealed my fate the night I— No. She cut him off and was before him in a flash, her eyes bright with anger. That is not true. Do not believe it. This curse, Valen, it is not real. He turned away from her. It certainly feels fucking real. The gods cursed me, and I deserved it. You do not deserve it, and it is not real. She rounded him, her gaze on his face, dark now and filled with fire. The Moirai do not have that sort of power. He stared into her eyes, letting the silence stretch thick and heavy between them. He slowed his breathing, hoping to quell his rage, but memories bombarded him, giving him no respite, building the storm within him. But Zeus does, he said, and sorrow stole through him when she turned her cheek to him and gazed at the grass. Doesn't he? She nodded and wrapped her arms around herself. He's a fickle old bastard, and I hate him, he spat, and thunder rolled overhead. He laughed and used his own power to light up the sky, and the fury curling through him grew stronger. He hated that the man he despised most in the world shared the same power as he commanded. He edged away from her and fought for dominance over the black clouds spreading across the golden sky. Lightning arced in all directions, clashing and filling the air with harsh thunder. He raised his hand and let his power flow through him, conducting the white-purple bolts of electricity, forcing them to split and multiply until they ravaged the sky. They arced free of the clouds and slammed down into the earth, connecting it to the sky and shaking the world. A delicate hand came to rest on his raised arm and gently lowered it. Valen looked at her, caught the pity in her eyes, and glanced away. Thunder rumbled across the clouds. She touched the scar on his jaw and trailed her fingers down his neck, following the ragged skin. Do not curse at your uncle. What happened wasn't his fault, she whispered, and it soothed the tempest inside him, but didn't quell it completely. It spiked back up, fiercer than before, and he turned on her with a snarl. Electricity chased along his arms, and she stepped back from him, hands falling from him. He could have stopped it, Valen snapped, holding her gaze, making sure she knew it. He could have prevented her death. She smiled sadly, and tears lined her long, dark lashes. Gods, he was a bastard. His anger dissipated in the space of a heartbeat, and he couldn't bring himself to look at her. He shoved his fingers through the longer lengths of his blonde hair, dragging it back and tugging on it until it hurt, and ground his teeth against the pain beating fiercely in his chest. I know that, she whispered in a hoarse voice, one that carried a weight of sorrow that cut him to the bone. Do you think it does not haunt me? But what you did was the right thing to do. He got what he deserved. He clenched his jaw and held back his snarl and the darkness that rose within him again, urging him to shake the sky with his power. And some would say you in turn got what you deserved for daring to challenge your king. Valen bowed his head and then lifted his chin and fixed her with a cold glare. He is not my king. My father is my king. He threw his head back and shouted at the sky, I don't acknowledge the existence of any other. Hades is my king. Lightning split the sky, the golden bolt heading straight for him. He laughed and held his hand up, and the bolt veered away from him, tearing up the earth on the other side of the hill and spraying mud into the warm air. He grinned and threw his hand upwards, sending his own white-purple bolt into the sky. It struck the storm cloud and exploded, stilted streams of it blazing outwards in different directions, and a thunder so loud it hurt his ears. I'll finish what I started one day. I'm not a whelp anymore, Zeus. You'll pay for what you failed to do that day. You'll pay for letting her die. Silence stretched around him. Just like the bastard to ignore him. His chest heaved, his heart pounding, and rage burned through his veins. She sighed. Do not taunt him. The ground shook. Not his uncle this time, or his own power. She turned to him, her rosy lips curving into a sad smile. I must go. Valen calmed then, considered apologizing to Zeus or doing whatever it took for her to stay. Already? She nodded and gently swept her fingers across his cheek, and he was glad she went for the other side this time, away from his scar. Take care, she said, her tone soft and laced with affection that warmed him. You should not believe that you are cursed. You may feel as though the gods cursed you so none could love you, but it is not true. Your brothers love you, as do I, and as does your father. He took small comfort from that, but it wasn't enough. A woman could never love me, though. She smiled, her green eyes brightening and losing their somber edge. Time will tell on that one. There is love for all of us out there. He didn't believe that for a second, but he didn't contradict her. She was a hopeless romantic, after all. The ground rumbled and the earth split, and 4 huge obsidian horses erupted from it, dragging a large black chariot behind them, the gold detail on it flashing brightly in the evening light. They whinnied as they came to a halt a few meters away from the closing crevasse, and jostled and snorted, huge hooves stomping and plowing up the grass as they tossed their heads. It had been a long time since Valen had seen them, and he wanted to approach them to see if they remembered him, but remained where he was, unwilling to risk the inevitable rejection. The black beasts were angry, their eyes red and wild as they kicked and whinnied, a reflection of their master's feelings. You should go, Valen said to her. I'll be just fine. I always am. She didn't look as though she was going to leave, and then she slipped her hand into his. He walked with her to the black and gold chariot and helped her mount it. Do not hate Ares. She looked down into his eyes, hers pleading him to heed her words. Do not distance yourself so much from your brothers. I don't. She smiled serenely. I see more than you know. He opened his mouth to deny that too, but she spoke over him. How long has someone been following you? Her crimson eyebrows rose, and her eyes glittered with mischief. He couldn't deny her. She did see more than he realized. Just how much did she know? She took up the array of thick black leather reins, and the horses snorted and kicked at the ground, impatient to be on their way. It seemed their master wanted her back, and wasn't happy about the delay. A storm is coming. She held his gaze, hers as clear as glass, a sign that she was using her gift. Nature has told me that she is a storm born of the earth, bearing the name of an angel, but the skill of a devil. Valen frowned, and the horses reared and charged, thundering across the grass and spraying clumps at him. The ground trembled and cracked, and he turned in time to see the chariot disappearing into the darkness and the earth closing behind it. He mulled over what she had said. He hated that cryptic shit. A storm born of the earth, bearing the name of an angel and the skill of a devil? He wished she had just come out and told him what he already knew. There was an assassin on his tail. He would thank her for one thing, though. He hadn't known he was dealing with a woman. He smirked. His dull little city was about to get interesting. Chapter 19. Ares's brothers appeared in his apartment one by one, Charis the first to arrive with Callistus in tow. Callistus landed in the middle of Ares's CDs, cracking a few of the covers. He hadn't thought to tidy up the mess before he had called his brothers. It had seemed more important to get Megan settled and then tell them what happened, but now that they were appearing, he was having second thoughts. After everything that had happened tonight, he didn't need his DVDs and CDs getting trashed, too. He caught the unimpressed look in his older brother's green eyes. Thankfully, Charis didn't say anything about the missing amulet. He stooped and neatly stacked the CDs spread around Callistus's and his feet, and deposited them on the low cabinet of the entertainment center. Ares scooped up a bunch of DVDs, trying to clear the floor of his living room before more of his brothers arrived and destroyed them. Callistus picked up the CDs he had landed on and shot Ares an apologetic glance. He shrugged it off and looked between his brothers. Oldest and youngest. They were such a contrast, too. They shared the same slight build, but the similarities ended there. It wasn't just Charis's short black hair versus Callistus's long blonde hair, or their eyes that made them look like opposites. Charis always dressed impeccably, preferring his black polished leather shoes, black trousers, and a neat dress shirt with his long black coat. Callistus wore a tight faded black T-shirt paired with loose black combat trousers and army boots. To Megan, Callistus probably looked no older than his late 20s. In reality, he was in his mid-700s, and he had been a troublemaker for every one of those years. Marek appeared, followed by Diamond and Escher. Diamond ran his black-gloved fingers over the soft white spikes of his hair, and then huddled into his long black coat and tugged the tall neck of his navy jumper up to cover more of his throat. He and Escher must have come from Tokyo, where it was probably colder than New York right now, rather than subtropical Hong Kong. Escher's blue gaze scanned the apartment and blackened, turning as stormy as the ocean. Ares sighed and crossed the room to him, passing Marek as he righted the couch. He squeezed Escher's shoulder through his long black coat, gaining his attention. His younger brother's eyes cleared, lightening and losing their feral edge. "All good here," Ares said, and Escher frowned at him, his black eyebrows pinching tightly, and then nodded and settled his hand over Ares's where it still gripped his shoulder. He chanced a glance at the trident on the inside of Escher's wrist. Blacker than midnight. Not a good sign. It wasn't the first time that he had noticed Escher's eyes and his favor mark didn't match on an emotional level. The trident spoke of Escher's conflict and anger, even if his eyes didn't. His younger brother had somehow learned to control what showed in his eyes. That wasn't a good thing. Escher blinked, and when he opened his eyes again, they were fixed on Megan where she slept in Ares's bed. His lips compressed into a thin line, and black obliterated the blue in his irises. Ares squeezed his shoulder, barely holding back his urge to growl at the threat his brother had just tossed at a woman he cared about. Escher's gaze roamed back to him and lightened again, but the trident on the inside of his wrist remained dark. Ares glanced at Diamond where he stood behind Escher, and found him looking at Escher's wrist, too. His white-haired brother's pale eyes rose to meet Ares's, and the look in them told him everything. He was worried, too. concerned that Escher was slowly drawing more and more into himself. How long would it be before Escher completely shut himself away in the mansion, never leaving it unless the gate or his brothers needed him? Escher calmed and unzipped the loose black hooded jersey top he wore beneath his coat, revealing a dark gray T-shirt. The arrowhead pendant on the black thong around his neck was dark too, almost black rather than sapphire. It wasn't an emotional barometer like his favor mark. This pendant warned that the moon was almost full. No wonder Escher was so quick to lose his temper today. The moon was playing havoc with him. Valen appeared with his usual theatrics, tearing the silence apart with a clap of thunder. Aries' mood took a sharp downwards turn when Megan moaned and rolled onto her side, curling up. It had taken him close to an hour of lying with her, telling her that she was safe and he would protect her, to get her to sleep. She needed her rest to recover from both her injuries and the emotional ordeal of what had happened, and part of him didn't want her awake during this meeting. She was strong, but if she heard what he was going to tell his brothers, and where that would inevitably lead the conversation, she would grow scared again. Valen scrubbed a hand roughly over his face and through his hair, tousling the messy blonde lengths. He looked like hell, and wherever he had been, it had been raining. His long black coat carried spots of water, and his black T-shirt was wet, sticking to his skin. And he smelled familiar. Lilies. Everyone turned on him as one, and Escher lunged forwards. Aries caught his arm and held him back, offering him a sympathetic smile when Escher turned incredulous eyes on him. Valen smirked at him. There was a faint tang of electricity in his scent, too, and it wasn't Valen's brand. Karis stepped forward. "Have you been angering our uncle again?" Valen turned on him. "Piss off, and get on with it. I've got business to deal with in Rome." "The gate needs you?" Aries gently kneaded Escher's shoulder, trying to soothe him and keep him calm. Escher always went off the rails if their mother came to the mortal world to see Valen and didn't linger to see anyone else. Aries had never understood why she fussed over him so much. It didn't help matters. It only made Valen worse. "No." Valen didn't look as though he was going to expand on that. Karis's green eyes darkened a full shade, and he ran a hand around the cropped back of his head. Aries had seen him do that enough times to know his brother was reining in his anger so he could deal with Valen in a calm manner. Sometimes Aries wanted Karis to let rip and put Valen in his place. He would pay to see that. "Then what is so important that you want to skip this meeting?" Karis said, with a sharp edge to his voice, one that betrayed his growing frustration. "A woman." Valen gave a pointed glance in Megan's direction. "What can I say? Love must be in the air." The look in Valen's golden eyes and the note in his tone said that he wasn't serious, and whoever this woman was, she was unlikely to live to see the weekend. Was she a demon? Valen's gaze scanned the apartment, and his sandy eyebrows rose. "Shit! I thought my place was a mess. You're supposed to be neat when you're trying to impress a woman, Aries, not turn your home into a pigsty." Aries huffed. "It wasn't my doing." "Megan throw a shit fit at you?" His brother flicked a glance at him, and Aries growled. "No. The demon was after her power, not mine, and he attacked her. I got to her in time, but the demon hightailed it when the sun rose. The next thing I know, someone is in my apartment, and they're taking my amulet. We need to get it back before night falls." Aries raked his fingers through his overlong hair and hoped his brothers didn't probe too deeply into the situation, and focused on the retrieval of the amulet instead. "Is Megan well?" That question leaving Karis's lips, and the concern in his eyes that backed up the softness of his tone, had shock rippling through Aries. After the intervention his oldest brother had staged in Tokyo, he hadn't expected him to give a fuck about Megan's well-being. If he was being honest, he had expected Karis to call him out on his relationship with her and then demand that he take her back to her apartment and end it. A little shaken, and some cuts and bruises, but nothing she won't heal. Ares looked pointedly at each of his brothers in turn. She's resting, so I want you all to keep it down. Got it? Everyone but Karis nodded. His older brother frowned, the action marring his looks and reminding Ares of their father. Karis had got their father's looks and their mother's eyes, and every woman in the underworld and this one wanted to bed him because of it. Unfortunately for them, Karis wasn't interested. He had been celibate during their time in this world, and Ares had a feeling he knew why. Megan mentioned that she tried to touch my amulet before, but it repelled her. I think we were both surprised the demon managed to take it. I didn't think it possible. Marek chimed in. It's entirely possible that it is because he has your power, but there is an equal probability that it is something any strong demon or hellspawn could do. Has anyone else had a demon or hellspawn attempt to take your amulet? This time, everyone shook their heads. None of the bastards have been crazy enough to try it, Valen spat, and then grinned. I wish they had. I would have torn them apart rather than let them run off with it like Ares did. Ares leveled his brother with a warning glare. If he kept shooting his mouth off, Ares was going to silence him by busting his jaw with a right hook. Karis's green eyes took on a decidedly cold edge as they settled on him, freezing his train of thought and sending a chill down his spine. He had the feeling he was about to get his arse handed to him. It's daylight. Karis flicked a glance at the windows, and Ares got the impression it was more for dramatic pause than emphasizing his point. Why would a demon come to your apartment during the day, when you would obviously be sleeping here? Ares dropped his attention to his feet. I wasn't here at the time. He didn't need to see Karis to know that right now his older brother would look thoroughly unimpressed, verging on ready to scold him. Valen snorted. Were you at your girlfriend's house, banging her? Ares growled at him and pinned him with a hard glare. Watch your mouth. A wicked smile tugged at Valen's lips, and he came around the couch, his back to the kitchen. Answer enough. Ares got laid. About freaking time she put out and you got it on. Diamond glanced away from them all, towards the windows, his pale blue eyes fixing on the world outside. It's raining again. It's possible that a demon would brave the weather to get what he wanted. Ares wasn't listening. He stormed towards Valen, cocked his arm, and threw a hard right hook at his younger brother. It caught Valen across the jaw and sent him stumbling backwards into the breakfast bar, but unfortunately didn't dislocate his jaw as intended. His back slammed into the edge of the granite counter, and he slumped, but his elbows caught on the counter, keeping him from hitting the deck. Valen snarled and launched himself at Ares, swinging hard at the same time. Karis appeared between them, and Valen's fist connected with his jaw, sending their older brother's head snapping to his right. Karis didn't even flinch. Valen froze, fear in his eyes now as the whole room fell silent and waited. Karis showed absolutely no reaction at all, and not a trace of pain. What the hell? Valen's punch hadn't been playful. He hadn't held back, but Karis looked as though he had felt nothing. Ares had fought Karis in the past, back in the underworld, and his brother had shown pain just like the rest of them. Karis straightened, and his green eyes slid to Valen. There was a challenge in them, a dare to strike him again, almost as though he wanted it to happen. Their younger brother backed off a step and casually leaned against the breakfast bar. Karis's gaze shifted to Ares, and he frowned at the brief flicker of disappointment in it. It wasn't directed at Ares, but towards their younger brother. Had Karis really wanted Valen to strike him again? Things must have been too quiet in Paris recently if Karis was itching for a fight and was willing to have it out with one of his own brothers to get it. Diamond tried again, his voice terse this time. "The weather is crappy. It would be easy for a strong demon to move around when it's raining like Escher's bored out of his tree and entertaining himself." That got everyone's attention and earned him a glare from Escher. Ares wasn't sure why Escher was annoyed. The world did suffer when he was bored. He had a tendency to make it rain for days until rivers burst their banks, crops failed, and meteorologists tried desperately to explain where the mysterious weather system had come from and why it wasn't moving. He had to be the only person in the world who loved it when it rained. Ares hated it. If the demon knew that Ares was occupied and unlikely to return quickly, he might have been willing to risk a little exposure to sunlight. Diamond's eyes slid to Megan and diverted away again, fixing on Ares's motorcycle and then Ares. Ares silently cursed Valen for what he had said, knowing that it would have pained Diamond. He had been without physical contact for all their time in the mortal world, too, had suffered with Ares as their brothers found romantic relationships and lived a normal life. Megan murmured in her sleep, and everyone looked at her. She writhed under the red covers, kicking at them, and moaned. He couldn't bear to see her suffering either, even if it was only a bad dream. She lashed out with her arms and moaned again, murmuring things in her sleep, and then thrashed around, her movements becoming frantic. Ares crossed the room to her, unable to stand by and do nothing. He didn't care that his brothers were watching him, curiosity etched on all of their faces. He sat beside her on the bed, and she moaned and pushed at the covers, revealing her dark red camisole. If she pushed them much further, she would flash his brothers a glimpse of her colorful underwear. He pulled the covers back up to her chest, but she fought them and then him. "Megan," he whispered, and gently took hold of her upper arms, his thumbs caressing her soft skin. "Wake up, sweetheart." She groaned and threw her head side to side, kicked her legs beneath the covers, and lashed out at him with her hands, snagging his black T-shirt and yanking on it. "Megan," he said, firmer this time. She calmed. Her eyes snapped open. She launched into his arms. Gods, she was trembling. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her head to his chest, feeling her shaking and her heart racing, and smoothed her tangled dark hair, combing it with his fingers. He pressed a long kiss to her forehead, waiting for her trembling to subside. "Ares," she breathed, his name soft on her lips, stirring heat within him and calling to his protective instincts. He held her closer, rubbing her back with his free hand, and frowned as he found her top damp with sweat. "I'm here, sweetheart," he whispered, and she twisted his T-shirt into her fingers and held on to him, her breathing still too fast for his liking. "Bad dream?" She nodded, her cheek brushing his chest. "I dreamed they were hurting you, and I couldn't stop them." She moved, nuzzling her cheek against his chest. Bliss. Her hands settled on his biceps. Ecstasy. She curled into him, fitting against him perfectly and with such ease as though she belonged in his embrace, under his protection. He kissed her forehead again and stroked her back, letting her know that he was here with her and she was safe. She did belong in his arms. She was under his protection. "Just a bad dream," he murmured against her skin, and she nodded and pulled back. She smiled into his eyes, hers dark in the low light, but twinkling with affection that hit him square in the chest and made his heart pound. One of his brothers spoke. He wasn't sure who, was too focused on Megan to hear what they said, but if it had been rude, then Ares was going to kick some arse. Her smile slowly faded, and her gaze slid towards the living room. Her eyes shot wide, and she hid in his arms. "You could have told me you would have company while I slept." She slapped his arm, and even that was blissful. "You can join us if you're up for it." He brushed his lips across her hair and angled his body to block his brother's view of her. Any intel you have on the enemy would be appreciated." She nodded. "Wait here." He released her and rose from the bed, shot his brothers a warning glare that hit the target because they all turned away and talked amongst themselves, and went into his closet. He rifled through his clothes until he found his navy dressing gown and gave it to Megan. She slipped her arms into it and tied the belt around her waist, and then left the bed so quickly that even he didn't catch a glimpse of her bare legs. The terry-cloth robe dwarfed her, concealing everything, just the way he liked it. Megan was for his eyes only. Aries slipped his hand into hers and led her into the room. One by one, his brothers turned to face her, greeting her with smiles, some of which seemed genuine. Merrick's smile was widest, warming his brown eyes. He offered Megan the armchair, but she smiled and shook her head, and remained standing beside Aries, her hand firmly holding his. Gods, he couldn't remember the last time he had held anyone's hand. It felt good, and he didn't want to let go of her, but he didn't want to upset any of his brothers or invite comments about his love life either. He released her hand, and she glanced up at him. He wasn't going to glance at her, but he couldn't help himself. He dropped his gaze to hers and smiled, hoping to reassure her that everything was good between them. Her soft lips curved into a smile, and then she looked at his brothers, her eyes settling the longest on Diamond and skipping Valen and Escher entirely. Aries really hoped she hadn't heard anything that Valen had said about her. He looked at his younger brother, warning him without words to hold his tongue or lose it. "I am sorry you were pulled into this." Karis didn't smile. Not a trace of emotion crossed his face to back up his words. What was with his brother today? Megan shook her head. "I think I pulled you all into my mess, not the other way around. It's my fault that Aries lost his power. The demon wanted mine, and Aries protected me." "It isn't your fault." Aries chided her softly, and she smiled at him again, this one punching a hole through his chest and squeezing his heart. "It doesn't matter whose fault it is. The end result is the same." Merrick settled himself in the armchair and kicked his sandaled feet up onto the ebony coffee table and arched, stretching like a cat about to take a nap. Aries swore his brother spent most of his life sleeping. He smelled of hot sunshine, an aroma that always clung to him, as if he passed every waking and sleeping second out bathing in it. His black linen shirt was buttoned wrongly, too. He had probably been sleeping on the veranda of his house when Aries had called. Sometimes he felt a pang of envy over the fact that Merrick had been given the Seville gates to protect. No snow, just sunshine and dry heat. Sounded better than humid summers and icy winters. "I know," Aries said on a sigh. "I need to get my power and the amulet back. The gate is in danger now. I screwed up, and I'll fix it. The gate will be fine." Everyone turned to stare at Karis, where he stood at the end of the red couch nearest the kitchen and Valen. "What do you mean? The enemy has my amulet." Aries pointed behind him towards Central Park. "He can open the gate once night falls." Karis slowly shook his head, his expression turning serious. "No, they cannot. The amulets only protect us from the gatekeepers on the underworld side." "What?" Aries said in unison with his brothers. What Karis was saying made no sense at all. He stepped towards his older brother. "No. Father said that we had to have our amulet with us, so the gate would open in our presence." "And have any of you ever tried to open a gate without having it on you?" Karis looked at each of them in turn, and they all shook their heads. "I have." The room erupted, a barrage of questions flying at Karis, ranging from why he had tried such a thing and risked the wrath of the gatekeeper to why he had never told them. Karis ignored them all. "I tried it once, when we first arrived on Earth." His calm voice rose above the din, and everyone quieted and stared at him. The amulets are not parts of the key of Hades. Father told us that so we would use them as though they were." "He lied to us?" Escher said, tone blacker than a raging storm. Diamond was beside him in an instant. "I am sure Father had a reason if he did." Diamond hovered his gloved right hand above Escher's shoulder and smiled reassuringly when Escher looked across at him. "You can think of it like that, or you could think he was using tactics," Karras said, and everyone's attention returned to him. "We all use the amulets whenever we go to the gate, just as Father told us to. I still do it." "It's a ruse," Merrick whispered, and frowned at his feet before looking up at Ares and then the others. "The demons see us with the amulets, and now they believe them to be the parts of the key of Hades." "What's the key of Hades?" Megan's brow crinkled. Ares moved back to her and slid his arm around her shoulder, unsure how to explain it to her. "Us." Karras's green eyes lighted on them all, lingering longest on Ares. Shock rippled through the room, and Ares found it hard to swallow what his older brother was telling them. "We are?" he said, and Karras nodded. "Father created the gates and bound us to them by blood. He placed the power of the key of Hades into each of us." "That's great." Megan moved forwards, out of Ares's embrace. "You're all keys, but I still don't get what this key of Hades thing is." Ares settled his arm around her shoulders again, unable to resist his need to have her close to him while in the presence of his brothers. They wouldn't dare try anything, but he wasn't about to risk it. He wanted them all to know that Megan was his, and that if anyone so much as looked at her wrongly, he would fight them. He wouldn't be able to stop himself. His father's blood ran in his veins, and, by the gods, it made him possessive. He had never noticed it before meeting Megan, but he couldn't miss it now. He would fight anyone to protect what was his. She looked up at him, her rich brown eyes soft with affection that stole his attention, causing the whole world to fade into the background. "If he kisses her, I'm out of here. That shit is bound to gross me out," Valen said, snapping him back to the present. He tossed a dark snarl in his younger brother's direction, and then returned his attention to his beauty. "The key of Hades is the only way of opening one of the gateways to the underworld if you're a living soul. The dead can pass into the realm, but never out again. Father is very strict about that. He never releases the dead." He stared deep into her eyes and fought to keep his thoughts on track and off the path that kept telling him to go ahead and disgust Valen by kissing her. The living can only move in and out if they have permission from him, and to do that they use the gates. Hellspawn and gods can travel in and out of the underworld. Demons are banned. "So, if someone wants to go from this world to the underworld, they need to use the gates?" Now she was getting it. "Yes, and those gates need a key." "And apparently all of you are those keys?" She looked at them all, even Valen and Escher this time, her fine eyebrows slowly meeting in a frown. "Apparently." Ares was still waiting for that one to sink in. Father decided to fool the enemy into thinking that the amulets possessed the power to open the gates. He wanted to lure them out and make them reveal themselves. It worked, but now what? As soon as the demon uses it, he'll realize it isn't real. Which is why we need to make sure that doesn't happen. Karras stuck his hands in the pockets of his black trousers. "We need to find him and get your power back." "How?" "I want it back. No doubts about that. I need it back." Not just because he had a duty to protect the gate, but because he wanted to protect Megan and his home, and her home, too. He needed his power if he was going to do that. "We need to figure out who the demon is, and how to get your power back, and why he wants to open the gate." "The last one is fairly obvious." Escher's tone was still dark, black with the urge for violence that shone in his blue eyes. "The demon wants to destroy it." Ares wasn't so sure about that. The demon wanted Megan's power, and he showed no interest in the gate when I first encountered him. He strolled right past it, as though he was just out for a walk in the park at night. Perhaps it was a ploy. Diamond pulled his coat aside and stroked the gleaming silver hilt of a blade sheathed against his ribs, his black leather gloves a stark contrast against the metal. His pale blue eyes darkened, turning almost as rich as Escher's were normally, and Ares could see he was contemplating fighting demons. Ares had that same distant look whenever his mind turned to such a topic. He could have been studying you, watching you open the gate, seeing how it worked. He saw you use the amulet. Perhaps. But why go after Megan's power? Ares still wasn't convinced. Megan had said the demon wanted her power specifically, not his, and the demon really had tried to blend in and look human that night at the gate. Escher glared at Megan. The mortal. The disgust lacing that word had Ares stepping closer to her. His brother had forced himself to use a civilized word for her, rather than something foul, and Ares appreciated that, but he wasn't about to trust his brother around her. Can heal. Demons must know there are gatekeepers on the underworld side. He most likely wanted to guarantee he wouldn't get hurt. Or he wanted to guarantee that we couldn't hurt him when he tried to destroy the gate. Diamond stepped forwards, in line with Escher. Megan's power doesn't work that way. She can't heal herself, Ares snapped, hemorrhaging patience so rapidly he was liable to lose his temper if his brothers kept going around in circles. Everyone looked at Megan again, and she edged closer to him. What he wants with the gate is irrelevant. He has my amulet and my power, and I want them back. I might be able to help with that one, Merrick piped up, and eased his feet off the coffee table. He sat up and then stood. He had been so quiet that Ares had almost forgotten he was there. I ran a check on all the demons we've documented in the past. The records had a few interesting cases and a couple of potential leads. One not so good, and the other might be bad. Bad? Why? Callistus paused midway through retying his long blonde hair in a ponytail, a dark look crossing his face. It seemed all of his brothers were contemplating a nice fight against this demon. Ares was tempted to tell them all to back off, because this demon had become his personal prey the moment he had targeted Megan. The demon said he had been waiting for this moment, yes? Merrick glanced at Ares, and he nodded. Well, the search turned up a couple. Paris, 1892. 2 demons, one with the ability to do many things beyond a demon's normal powers, were sighted with a single young at the gate. What happened? Ares had a feeling he knew what his brother would say. Karis killed them. Merrick's dark eyes shifted to Karis at the same time as Ares looked at him. He didn't appear at all affected by that. Not many of them had ever taken down a demon child. It felt wrong, even though Ares knew that a young demon could be just as malevolent and dangerous as an adult one. He just couldn't get past their appearance and always ended up pulling his punches, part of him hoping the demon would learn their lesson and get away and never come back. All of them? Ares looked back at Merrick. No. Merrick shook his head. Karis's report states that he encountered the demons when they attempted to hitch a ride through the Paris gate. He engaged them, and the young escaped after witnessing his parents' deaths. Sounds like it could be our guy. So now Junior is back for vengeance? Ares said. He has a name. Megan's voice was small, barely a whisper, but it caught everyone's attention. He told you his name? His gaze whipped to her, and her eyes widened when his brothers stared at her, too. What the fuck was the demon doing telling her his name? Trying to hit on her? Sense said the demon had wanted to kill her, but the dangerously possessive side of him wasn't listening, was fixated on the idea that the demon had hit on his woman. She nodded and frowned at him when he growled low in his throat, a snarl of pure possessive rage. It wasn't as though I asked. It was as though he wanted me to know. What is his name, Megan? Merrick said, and Ares struggled to calm the anger pouring through his veins like acid. He wanted to rip the demon apart. Didn't care if Megan hadn't asked or not. He blasted straight through possessive to positively furious as sense finally won and screamed the real reason the demon had told her his name. He had wanted her to know the name of the man who was going to kill her. He was sick, and Ares was going to put him down. "Amori," she whispered. "Fuck me." Valen voiced what everyone must have been thinking. "Amori Moreau?" That wasn't good. "You know him?" Megan's voice was small again, and Ares looked down at her and shook his head. "We know of him, but none of us have ever met him. He has a reputation in the demon world. Everyone calls him Trickster. He uses powerful spells and enchantments to protect himself, or at least that's what the reports we heard stated. It's more likely those are powers he's stolen from people." Merrick scratched his stubbly jaw and frowned at the coffee table, his expression turning pensive. "But you've never met him before," Megan said, and everyone shook their head. "He has a tendency to target hellspawn, not gods." Karis stared at Megan. "You said he was after you, not Ares. It would fit his usual M.O. He must want to get through the gate, just as his parents did back then." Diamond came to stand beside the armchair. "That has to be it. He needs the power to heal and wanted to get it from Megan. He might not know what we do about her power." Ares had already considered that, but he had considered another, more unsettling reason, too, one that he still wasn't sure about sharing with his brothers. "Would that be a bad thing?" Megan whispered. Everyone stared at her again, most of his brothers giving her looks that asked if she had gone insane. Escher looked as though he was considering something dark and terrible. Ares placed his arm around her and pulled her against him, nestling her close to his side, and she settled her hand against his chest. "I mean, his parents must have wanted to go to the underworld so he could grow up there, with others like him." That dropped a bomb in the room, and it exploded, each one of his brothers speaking louder and louder in an effort to be heard above the din. He pulled her closer, shielding her in his embrace, giving them time to calm down before he got physical in order to protect her. She trembled and buried her face against his chest. It had irked him, too, but Megan didn't know any better, and she didn't deserve their wrath. Karis stood calm amongst the storm, staring at her. He raised his hand, and the others gradually backed off again, falling mute. Ares thanked Karis with a nod and looked down at Megan. She emerged and tilted her head back, her dark eyes full of anger mixed with fear. "His parents may have wanted him to go there, but now he wants to destroy it, Megan. He wants to destroy my home." He released her shoulder and smoothed his right palm across her cheek. "Don't pity him, Megan. All demons know that they're banished and forbidden to enter the underworld. This demon's parents knew that, but they still tried to take him through." "They wanted a place to live." She cut him off, the anger in her eyes obliterating the fear. "They wanted a place where they belonged, with others like them. Is that too much to ask? What gave you all the right to deny them that?" "Megan." She shoved out of his arms and stormed away from him, almost tripping on the hem of the robe as she headed through the bedroom. She grabbed the navy terry cloth and lifted it, and then dropped it again when she reached the sliding door to the balcony. She yanked it open and slid it shut behind her with such force that the glass shuddered. He stared after her, unsure what to do. She kept her back to him and leaned her arms on the railing of the balcony. He could feel his brother's eyes on him, drilling into him with a weight of expectation and anger. He sighed. She doesn't know everything yet, and it's been hard on her. She wasn't talking about the demon, Callistus said, and Ares closed his eyes. I know. Just because I'm good-looking, it doesn't mean I'm stupid. He smiled, opened his eyes, and looked across the room to his youngest brother. Callistus smiled too. Ares faltered, and he glanced back at Megan where she stood on the balcony. The ache to go to her was strong, almost debilitating, but he somehow managed to convince himself to remain with his brothers. If their positions were reversed, he would need a few minutes to cool off and collect himself. His decision to give her that time didn't give him the strength to keep his eyes off her, though. She straightened and wrapped her arms around herself, her shoulders hunching up. She would be getting damp in this horrible gray weather. The breeze played in her shoulder-length dark hair, catching the strands and making them flutter, and he burned with the need to go to her, wrap his arms around her, and pull her so her back rested flush against his front. He wanted to hold her and apologize, and explain so she understood why she had upset his brothers. But he had to finish the meeting first. If it is Amaury Moreau, then his behavior fits with what we know about him, Merrick continued as though her outburst had never happened, and Ares was thankful for it. He didn't want his brothers turning against her, not when it had started to feel as if they were going to accept her. She had been alone for too long, just like him, and she wanted a place to belong. He wanted to give her that place. He wanted it to be at his side, in his world. I looked into the type of demon the boy back then might have been, and also his parents, and with only one side of his lineage showing the power to take others' abilities, that skill would be diminished in him. That type of power doesn't come with the ability to teleport, though, but there are rare demon species who can do that. His other parent might have been one of them. Couldn't he have stolen that power? Diamond said, his pale blue eyes diamond-hard. Merrick shook his head, his wavy, tawny locks brushing the nape of his neck. No, I cross-referenced the records from the underworld, and it seems that this type of demon cannot take certain powers. Teleporting is one of them, which is why you can still do it. He still took my elemental power, so he isn't as weak as you think he is. Ares flicked a glance at Megan to check she was all right, and then forced his attention back to his brothers. He didn't like her being out there on the balcony alone. His wards protected that area too, but she was still vulnerable out there, beyond his reach. The demon could break through the ward again and snatch her before Ares could reach her. He must have a way of boosting his power, something that makes him able to take on several abilities and retain them. He should only be able to take one or possibly two max. From what you have told us, he has more than that at his disposal. Could it be an amulet? Ares frowned at Merrick, and he nodded. He wears something on his hand. I didn't get a good look at it. It's a gold disc with rubies, as far as I could tell. Megan remembered it from our fight in the alley and was coming to tell me when he attacked her. He definitely used it to take your power? Karis said. Ares rubbed his chest through his black button-down shirt. It burned like a bitch. It was your own power that burned you. Merrick peered at Ares's chest and scratched his jaw again. The amulet must have drawn the power out of you so it was easier for him to absorb. I can research it, but there are many different types of amulets out there, and that means a lot of variables. In English? He didn't have the patience for unraveling Merrick's usual way of speaking today. It's 50-50. There is a chance that destroying the amulet will give you back your power, or it might mean you kiss it goodbye forever. That wasn't comforting at all. What if I just kill the demon? Merrick and everyone frowned at him. We have been through this. I think it is safer if you take his amulet. He used it to take your power, so it might be the only thing helping him keep hold of it. That sounded much more comforting. He could beat the crap out of the demon and snatch his pretty jewelry. He began to smile, but it faded when he thought over what Merrick had told him. Surely there's a chance that destroying the amulet or taking it from him changes nothing? If it just boosts his natural ability, then it might not change a thing. He already has my power. He didn't want to consider that. There had to be a way to get his power back. His original plan of capturing the demon and beating the hell out of him until he surrendered his power was beginning to look like the best course of action after all. "I will look into it," Merrick said. Ares thanked him with a smile. "If I get a shot at him, I'm still taking him down." He shifted his gaze to Karis, gauging his reaction. Karis raised a single black eyebrow. "At least try not to kill him. Questioning him could prove useful. He might know something of value." Ares took that as permission to unleash holy hell on the demon. "We done here?" Valen said, and before Karis had even started to nod, he was gone, leaving curls of black smoke in his wake. "Someone has a hot date," Callistus said, and then shrugged when everyone shot him a questioning look. "Yeah, you're right. He's probably off to kill someone. Laters." Callistus saluted, the action revealing the dark blue script that tracked up the underside of his right forearm, and disappeared. Escher fixed Ares with a dark look that Ares knew was about Megan, and black smoke swirled up from his feet and engulfed him. When it dissipated, he was gone. "Diamond, I need a word," Ares said before he could disappear too. Diamond nodded. Merrick stepped, leaving minimal black mist behind. Karis looked beyond Ares to Megan. "Explain things to her, before she ends up getting you into a fight with your brothers, Ares." Ares nodded, and Karis teleported, leaving him with Diamond. "What's wrong?" Diamond rounded the ebony coffee table, buttoning his long black coat at the same time. "I need you to lend me a hand." Ares tracked him, slowly turning his back on Megan as he remained facing Diamond. Diamond stopped at the end of the couch where Karis had been. "We both know that the power most effective against my fire is your ice." Diamond's pale gaze flickered beyond Ares to Megan. "I really need you to have my back on this. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important." Ares needed his brother to know that he would have spared him the pain if he could, but he needed ice to combat his fire, and that meant Diamond would have to be around Megan, too. Diamond nodded. "I know. It must be nice not having to worry about your power for a change, though." He could see the pain in Diamond's icy blue eyes, even though his brother was working hard to mask it. "It's only nice if having part of what makes you who you are missing is nice. Personally, it doesn't feel nice to me. It feels like I'm no longer me," he said, and Diamond's gaze shifted to meet his. He smiled. "Maybe I'll offer the demon a swap. Your power for mine." Ares wanted to touch his brother's shoulder and squeeze it to show him that he knew what he was going through. The irony that he could have done such a thing if he had his power wasn't lost on him. His fire could have tempered Diamond's ice, at least for a short time, long enough to let his brother know that he wasn't alone. "Let's not do anything rash, or Karis will say I'm a bad influence on you." He forced a smile, and Diamond mirrored him. "I've got your back. Call me whenever you need me, and I'll be here." Diamond reached out and paused with his gloved hand only a few centimeters from Ares' shoulder. "We'll have you back to normal before you know it. I just hope you know what you're giving up." Ares knew. Diamond didn't need to bring it up. He knew every moment he was awake, and even when he was asleep. Diamond glanced at Megan over Ares' shoulder and disappeared, leaving swirling black mist behind. He heaved a sigh and turned to face her. Every second with Megan was precious, and he wasn't going to waste a single one. Starting right now, with making love to her.